Dawn arrived with a golden radiance filtering through the lace curtains, the same ones my grandmother had hand-woven decades ago. I remained motionless in bed, watching how the light painted familiar patterns on the ceiling of the bedroom where I had slept throughout my childhood. Now, at 35, I found myself here again, but the circumstances were entirely different. This three-story Victorian house in the quiet Oakwood neighborhood was no longer simply the home where I had grown up. For the past 3 months, it had been officially mine. A property with my name on the deed, along with a substantial sum of money that my father had specifically left for its restoration. The thought provoked a contradictory mixture of gratitude and pain. The house was mine because my father was no longer here. Robert Lawson had passed away in June after a long battle with cancer, a fight I had witnessed helplessly, watching as the robust, energetic man I remembered gradually became a shadow of himself. Yet, until the end, he maintained his dignity and his sense of humor. "Elena," he had said during one of our final conversations, his voice barely a whisper but his blue eyes, so like my own, still sharp and clear. "This house has been in our family for 4 generations. It's seen births and deaths, celebrations and sorrows. It holds our history in its walls." I had nodded, holding his frail hand, trying to memorize the feel of it, knowing our time was running short. "I'm leaving it to you," he continued. "Not because you're my only child, but because you're the only one who truly understands its value. Money can build new houses, but it can't build new memories. It can't create history." I remembered those words now as I slipped out of bed, my bare feet meeting the cool hardwood floors that had been walked upon by my ancestors since 1892. The house needed work, the roof leaked in 2 places, the plumbing was temperamental, and the electrical system desperately needed updating. But beneath these flaws lay impeccable craftsmanship and architectural details that modern builders could only dream of replicating. I pulled on my robe and made my way downstairs, avoiding the 3rd step from the bottom that had creaked for as long as I could remember. The house was quiet except for the gentle hum of the refrigerator, another appliance on the list for replacement. I started the coffee maker, a sleek modern contraption that looked out of place in the vintage kitchen, and stared out the window at the expansive backyard. The property sat on almost an acre of land, a rarity in this part of town. The sprawling oak tree that had given me shade during countless summer afternoons still stood strong, its leafless branches now stretched against the November sky like arthritic fingers. In a few hours, this quiet, peaceful space would be filled with the voices of my husband's family, all gathered for Thanksgiving dinner. My husband, James Morgan. The thought of him brought a complicated smile to my face. We had met 6 years ago at a charity gala. I was there representing the Historical Preservation Society where I worked, and he was accompanying a client from his investment firm. Tall, with warm hazel eyes and a disarming smile, James had a way of making everyone in his orbit feel special. That night, his focus had been entirely on me, and I had been captivated. Our courtship had been a whirlwind. James was decisive in all things, from which restaurant we should try to when we should move in together. 4 years ago, we had married in a ceremony that my father had still been well enough to attend. I remembered how proud he looked walking me down the aisle, even as I noticed the way he leaned slightly on his cane, the first visible sign of the illness that would eventually claim him. James and I had settled into a comfortable life in our downtown condo, close to both our workplaces. We had talked about children, but somehow the time never seemed quite right. His career was taking off, with more responsibilities and clients. My position at the Preservation Society was becoming more demanding as well. We fell into a routine that was pleasant if not passionate: weekend brunches, occasional vacations, Netflix evenings with takeout. Then my father's health began to seriously decline, and everything changed. I found myself spending more time at the family home, first helping with his care, then managing hospice visits, and finally, dealing with the aftermath of his passing. Through it all, James had been supportive in his way, though he never quite understood my attachment to the house or my grief. He was a forward-looking man, uncomfortable with dwelling on pain or the past. The coffee maker beeped, pulling me from my reverie. I poured myself a cup and made my way to the dining room, where I had already set out the serving dishes we would need for today's feast. They were my mother's china, delicate, cream-colored with a soft floral pattern around the edges. Mom had died when I was in college, a sudden heart attack that had left Dad and me reeling. He had never remarried, saying Mom had been the love of his life, and no one could ever replace her. I ran my finger along the edge of a serving platter, remembering how she used to let me help polish these pieces before special occasions. "Careful hands, Elena," she would say. "These dishes have stories to tell. One day they'll be yours to care for." Now they were mine, along with everything else. The lawyer had called yesterday to confirm that the last of the paperwork had been processed. The inheritance was officially in my name, including the house and the funds my father had carefully set aside, partly from his own savings, partly from a life insurance policy, and partly from the sale of his beloved vintage car collection which had been his passion for decades. The total sum was substantial, just over $850,000. Not a fortune by today's standards, but more than enough to fully restore the house to its former glory and still have a comfortable cushion left over. When the lawyer had mentioned the amount, I had felt a strange sense of unreality. My father had always lived modestly, driving the same car for years, patching his clothes rather than replacing them. I never realized he had been quietly building this nest egg all along, planning for a future he wouldn't be part of. My phone buzzed on the counter. My mother-in-law, Margaret. "Elena, dear," she chirped when I answered. "Just checking what time we should arrive. Richard wants to know if we should bring ice." Margaret Morgan was a perfectly coiffed, perpetually busy woman who ran the social calendar of a country club with the precision of a military campaign. At 63, she still colored her hair the exact shade of blonde she'd maintained since her 20s and kept herself rigorously thin through what she called sensible eating, but what I had observed was really just permanent semi-starvation. 3 o'clock would be perfect, I replied. And yes, ice would be helpful. The ice maker here isn't working properly. Another thing to fix in that old place, she said with a sigh that wasn't quite sympathetic. James mentioned you've been getting contractor quotes. It all sounds dreadfully expensive. I bit back a defensive response. Margaret had made her feelings about my inheritance and the house quite clear. In her view, it would have been more sensible to sell it immediately and use the proceeds for something practical, though she had never specified what that might be. "It's worth the investment," I said instead. "The historical value alone, yes, of course, dear," she interrupted. "We'll see you at 3 then. Richard sends his love." She hung up before I could respond, leaving me staring at my phone. My father-in-law, Richard Morgan, was unlikely to have mentioned love or any other emotion. A successful commercial real estate developer, Richard approached life like a series of transactions to be negotiated. Every conversation with him felt like he was assessing the potential value proposition. Even his rare compliments came across as performance evaluations. The Morgan family was completed by James's older sister Diane, her husband Kevin, and their 2 teenage children, Tyler and Zora. Diane had followed in her father's footsteps, working for his development company and proving herself every bit as shrewd and business-minded. Kevin was a tax attorney who rarely spoke about anything other than potential deductions or the failings of the current administration. Their children were typical teenagers, Tyler permanently attached to his gaming devices, Zora alternating between sullen silence and passionate declarations about social justice causes. Collectively, the Morgans were a force to be reckoned with, successful, opinionated, and accustomed to getting their way. They were also, as James frequently reminded me, family. My family now too, though I never felt entirely comfortable in their presence. There was always an underlying current of evaluation, as if they were constantly assessing whether I measured up to their standards. The sound of the front door opening announced James's return from his morning run. A moment later, he appeared in the kitchen doorway, his athletic frame silhouetted against the morning light. At 38, my husband still maintained the physique of the college rowing champion he had once been, his daily 5-mile runs as much a part of his routine as brushing his teeth. "Morning," he said, crossing the kitchen to kiss my cheek. "You're up early." "Lots to do," I replied, gesturing to the stack of recipe cards on the counter. 20-pound turkey doesn't cook itself. James poured himself a glass of water, draining it in one long gulp. Need help with anything? I smiled despite myself. For all his faults, James's offers of assistance were always genuine. You could peel the potatoes after your shower. I need about 10 pounds for the mashed potatoes and the gratin. 10 pounds? We're feeding 8 people, not an army. Leftovers are the best part of Thanksgiving, I countered. And your father always takes seconds of the potatoes. James laughed, a warm sound that reminded me of why I had fallen in love with him. Dad does love his carbs, despite Mom's constant monitoring. He moved closer, wrapping his arms around me from behind. Speaking of my parents, Mom called me about some exciting news we're supposedly sharing today. Any idea what that's about? I stiffened slightly in his embrace. None. Maybe she's confused. Maybe, he agreed, though he didn't sound convinced. I'll grab that shower now. Potatoes await. As James headed upstairs, I turned my attention to the turkey, removing it from the refrigerator where it had been brining overnight. As I rinsed and patted it dry, I felt a strange sense of foreboding that I couldn't quite place. Margaret's reference to exciting news bothered me more than I wanted to admit. The inheritance. It had to be about that. But how would Margaret even know the legal details had been finalized? I hadn't told anyone except James. Of course I had told James. Last night, as we were getting ready for bed, I had mentioned the lawyer's call. That's wonderful news, he had said, his face lighting up in a way that seemed almost too enthusiastic for such a somber topic. So everything's officially yours now? Yes, I had confirmed. The house, the restoration fund, everything. He had kissed me then, a little too hard, a little too possessively. We should celebrate. We hadn't, though. I had been too tired, too wrapped up in preparations for today. James hadn't pushed, which was unusual for him. Normally, when he wanted something, he was persistent. Instead, he had simply turned off his bedside lamp and rolled over, murmuring a good night that felt strangely perfunctory. Now, as I prepared the turkey for roasting, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. James and his mother spoke almost daily, a closeness I had initially found endearing but which occasionally veered into territory that made me uncomfortable. They shared everything, from trivial daily annoyances to major life decisions. Had he told her about the inheritance being finalized? And if so, why would there be exciting news to share at Thanksgiving dinner? My phone rang again, interrupting my troubling thoughts. This time, it was my own mother's name on the screen, or rather, the name I had kept in my contacts even after her death. I had transferred her number to my father years ago when he finally decided to get a cell phone, but I could never bring myself to change the contact information. Now, seeing Mom flash on my screen brought a bittersweet pang. Hey, Mom, I answered softly, the familiar greeting a comfort even though I knew it was Dad's phone. Hi, sweetie, came the voice of Elaine Bennett, my father's longtime companion. After Mom died, Dad had been alone for nearly a decade before meeting Elaine at a classic car show. They had never married, both felt they were too old for such formalities, but they had been inseparable for the last 6 years of Dad's life. I had initially been wary of Elaine, protective of my mother's memory, but her genuine kindness and the obvious happiness she brought my father had eventually won me over. Sorry, I said quickly. I still have Dad's number saved as Mom. Force of habit. No need to apologize, Elaine assured me. I just wanted to call and wish you a happy Thanksgiving. I know it's the first one without your dad, and those firsts are always the hardest. I gripped the phone tighter, grateful for her understanding. Though technically not family by law, Elaine had shown more empathy during my grieving process than many blood relatives. Thanks, Elaine. I wish you could be here. Me too, love. But this cruise was non-refundable, and your father would have had my heart if I'd wasted the money he insisted I spend on myself. There was a smile in her voice despite the sadness. Dad had booked her on the Mediterranean cruise months in advance, making her promise to go even if he wasn't around to accompany her. I'm in Barcelona today. It's beautiful, but it doesn't feel much like Thanksgiving without cranberry sauce and pumpkin pie. I'll save you some of both, I promised. How's the trip otherwise? As Elaine launched into an enthusiastic description of the Spanish coastline, I continued preparing the turkey, the familiar task soothing my frayed nerves. She was right, the firsts were the hardest. First birthday without him, first Father's Day, and now, first Thanksgiving. Christmas loomed on the horizon like an emotional mountain I wasn't sure I had the strength to climb. Oh, and Elena, Elaine said, her tone changing slightly. Did the lawyer call? He said the final paperwork would be processed this week. Yesterday, I confirmed. Everything's been transferred. The house is officially mine now, along with the restoration fund. Good, she said firmly. That's exactly what Robert wanted. He loved that house, and he knew you did too. It's where he felt closest to your mother. I swallowed the lump in my throat. I know. I'm going to make it beautiful again, just like he wanted. I have no doubt you will, love. Now, I should go. International rates and all that. Give my best to James and have a wonderful Thanksgiving. Your dad would want you to enjoy the day. After saying goodbye, I stood in the silent kitchen, my hands sticky with herb butter for the turkey. Dad would want me to enjoy the day. I would try, for his sake. But the unease about Margaret's exciting news lingered like a shadow in the back of my mind. By noon, the house was filled with the intoxicating aroma of roasting turkey and simmering cranberry sauce. I had just put the sweet potato casserole, topped with a ridiculous amount of marshmallows and pecans, into the oven when James appeared in the kitchen doorway. Something smells amazing, he said, his hair still damp from his shower. Potatoes are all peeled and waiting in cold water, as requested. Thanks, I replied, wiping my hands on my apron, the vintage one with embroidered fall leaves that had been my grandmother's. Can you check the dining room table? I think we'll need the extra leaf if we are going to fit everyone comfortably. James hesitated, which was unusual. Normally, he tackled practical tasks with immediate efficiency. Actually, I wanted to talk to you about something first. That sense of foreboding returned, stronger now. What is it? He crossed the kitchen, leaning against the counter opposite me. I've been thinking about the inheritance. The money, specifically. I stilled, my hand halfway to the refrigerator door. What about it? Well, it's a significant amount. I think we should consider our options carefully before committing it all to renovations on this place. The money is specifically for the house, I reminded him. That's what Dad wanted. James shifted, a hint of impatience crossing his features. Your father wanted you to be happy and secure. The house is just a physical structure. There might be better ways to honor his memory while also securing our future. I carefully closed the refrigerator, turning to face him fully. What are you suggesting? He straightened, his expression brightening with an enthusiasm that seemed almost practiced. An investment opportunity. Something Dad's been working on for months. A luxury resort development in the mountains, about 2 hours from here. The location is perfect, stunning views, access to skiing in winter, hiking in summer. The investors are all lined up, but we need capital for the initial land purchase. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. You want to use my inheritance for a resort development? Our inheritance, he corrected, a slight edge to his voice. We're married, Elena. This affects both our futures. You and your father have been planning this? For how long? He waved his hand dismissively. The details aren't important. What matters is that this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The projected returns are incredible. We could triple the investment within 5 years. My mind was racing. Does your mother know about this? Is this the exciting news she mentioned? James had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. We thought it would be nice to share it with everyone today. A family opportunity, a new beginning. A family opportunity, I repeated slowly. Your family's opportunity, you mean? Using my inheritance. His expression hardened slightly. Our inheritance, Elena. And yes, it would benefit my family too. Is that so wrong? They're your family now as well. I took a deep breath, trying to center myself. James, I appreciate that you've found an investment you believe in. But this money was left to me for a specific purpose, to restore this house. My family home. I can't just redirect it to a business venture I know nothing about. You haven't even heard the details yet, he argued, his tone becoming cajoling. At least let me and Dad explain it properly. You'll see how perfect it is. Perfect for whom? I asked quietly. Your father's development company? Your investment portfolio? A flash of something, anger? Frustration? Crossed his face before he smoothed his expression back into its usual charm. For all of us, Elena. Think of it as a legacy your father could never have imagined, not just a restored old house, but a thriving business that could support generations of our family. He paused, moving closer, his voice softening. Including our children, whenever we decide to have them. The mention of children, a topic that had become increasingly sensitive over the past year, felt manipulative, and I took a step back. I need time to think about this, I said finally. Today isn't the right moment to make financial decisions, especially not about my father's legacy. James looked like he wanted to argue further but glanced at his watch instead. We can discuss it more later. I should get that leave for the dining table. He leaned in to kiss me, but I turned slightly, and his lips landed on my cheek instead of my mouth. If he noticed my withdrawal, he didn't comment on it, simply turning and leaving the kitchen. Alone again, I gripped the edge of the counter, my knuckles turning white. James had never shown any interest in the house beyond tolerating my attachment to it. He'd made it clear on multiple occasions that he found it outdated, inconvenient, and, in his words, a money pit. The fact that he and his father had been planning to use my inheritance, apparently for months, without consulting me, felt like a betrayal. I thought of my father's words again, "You're the only one who truly understands its value." Had he somehow anticipated this situation? Is that why he had been so specific in his will about the purpose of the money? My phone rang once more, pulling me from my thoughts. It was Sarah Wilson, my attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had handled my father's estate. I hesitated before answering, wondering if this was yet another sign that today was heading in a troubling direction. "Elena," Sarah greeted me, her voice crisp as always. "Sorry to bother you on a holiday. I just wanted to confirm you received the final documentation I emailed last night." "I did," I replied, lowering my voice and glancing toward the dining room where I could hear James moving chairs. "Everything looks in order." "Good. I also wanted to remind you of the trust stipulations your father put in place. The primary residence cannot be sold for at least 5 years without triggering certain clauses that would redirect a portion of the funds to the Historical Preservation Society." I frowned, not recalling this detail from our previous discussions. "I don't remember that part." "It's in Section 12 of the trust documents. Your father added it during our last revision, about 2 weeks before he passed. He was quite insistent about it." A chill ran through me. 2 weeks before he died, when James had been spending more time at the house, ostensibly helping with Dad's care. Had my father overheard something? Suspected something? "There's also the matter of the restoration fund," Sarah continued. "It's structured as a separate entity from the general inheritance. Any use of those funds for purposes other than maintaining or improving the primary residence would require court approval and would likely be denied based on the explicit language in the trust." My mind was racing. So the money can't legally be used for other investments? Not without significant legal gymnastics, which I would strongly advise against. Your father was very clear about his wishes. She paused. "Is there a concern I should be aware of, Elena?" I hesitated, not ready to voice my suspicions even to my attorney. "No, just clarifying the details. It's been an emotional time." "Of course." "Well, enjoy your Thanksgiving. We can discuss any other questions next week if needed." After hanging up, I stood motionless in the kitchen, processing this new information. My father had anticipated this. Somehow, he had known or suspected that there might be attempts to use the money for purposes other than the house, and he had taken legal steps to prevent it. The realization was both comforting and deeply unsettling. The sound of the front door chime jolted me from my thoughts. It was only 2:30, earlier than expected for the Morgans' arrival. I quickly wiped my hands and went to answer it, surprised to find my best friend, Maya Richardson, standing on the porch with a bottle of wine and a small potted chrysanthemum. "Surprise," she said with a grin. "I'm not staying. I know you have the in-laws descending soon. But I wanted to drop these off and check on you. First Thanksgiving without Robert is a big deal." I hugged her tightly, suddenly fighting tears. Maya had been my friend since college, the person who helped me through my mother's death, and more recently, my father's illness. She was family in all the ways that mattered. "Come in for a minute," I urged, pulling her into the foyer. I could use a friendly face before the Morgan invasion. Maya followed me into the kitchen, setting the wine on the counter and perching on a bar stool. With her dark curls, warm brown skin, and perpetually amused expression, she was the opposite of the Morgan family's cool, polished reserve. As a pediatric nurse, she dealt with real life every day, messy, emotional, and unfiltered, and had little patience for pretense. "How are you really doing?" she asked, studying my face with the practiced eye of someone who regularly assesses patients' well-being. "Honestly, I'm not sure." I filled her in quickly on James's revelation about the investment plans and my subsequent call with Sarah. Maya's expression grew increasingly concerned as I spoke. "That doesn't sound good, Elena," she said finally. "They were planning to announce this at Thanksgiving dinner? Without discussing it with you privately first?" "Apparently." She shook her head. "Classic manipulation tactic. Make a public announcement so you feel pressure to agree, or at least not to object too strongly. Not cool." "I know." I leaned against the counter. "The thing is, it makes me wonder what else I don't know. If James and his father have been planning this for months, then what other decisions have they been making about your life without your input?" Maya finished for me. "Valid question." She reached for my hand. "What are you going to do?" I sighed. "Get through today, for starters. Then have a serious conversation with James about boundaries and respect." "Good plan." "And if that conversation doesn't go well?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications I wasn't ready to face. Before I could respond, James called from the dining room. "Elena? Did I hear the door?" Maya squeezed my hand once more before releasing it. "That's my cue. Call me tomorrow, okay? Or tonight, if you need an escape plan." I walked her to the door, grateful for her support but increasingly anxious about the evening ahead. As Maya left, I caught a glimpse of Richard and Margaret's luxury SUV turning onto our street, right on time as always. "Your in-laws are arriving," I told James as I returned to the dining room, where he had successfully installed the table leaf and was now arranging chairs. He straightened, smoothing down his cashmere sweater, a Christmas gift from his mother the previous year. "Perfect timing." He hesitated, studying my face. "Elena, about earlier. I don't want us to be at odds today. Let's enjoy the holiday, and we can discuss the investment opportunity more tomorrow." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. James seemed to take my silence as agreement, his expression relaxing as he moved toward the foyer to greet his parents. Through the window, I watched as Richard emerged from the driver's side of the SUV, his tall frame imposing even at a distance. He was wearing what he probably considered casual attire, pressed khakis and a button-down shirt under a sport coat. Margaret appeared a moment later, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed, a large covered dish in her hands. Despite telling me she would bring ice, she had apparently decided to contribute to the menu as well, likely one of her signature light dishes that contain more artificial sweetener than actual food. As they made their way up the walkway, I took a deep breath, preparing myself for the performance ahead. Today, I would be the gracious hostess, the dutiful daughter-in-law. I would serve the traditional Thanksgiving meal in my childhood home and raise a glass to family togetherness. But beneath that performance, I would be watching and listening more carefully than ever before. Because one thing had become abundantly clear in the past few hours, the Morgan family had plans for my inheritance that had nothing to do with honoring my father's wishes or respecting my choices. And despite what James believed, This wasn't just about money or property. It was about autonomy and respect. It was about my history and my future. It was about whether my marriage was truly a partnership or simply another transaction in the Morgan family business plan. The doorbell rang, and I plastered on a smile. Let the performance begin. Margaret, Richard, I greeted them as James opened the door. Happy Thanksgiving. Margaret air-kissed my cheek, the cloud of her expensive perfume momentarily overwhelming. Elena, dear. The house looks, she paused, visibly searching for a diplomatic term. Exactly the same. We haven't started the renovations yet, I explained, taking the covered dish from her hands. What have you brought? Just a little something, she replied with false modesty. My cauliflower rice stuffing. I thought you might appreciate a healthier option among all the traditional dishes. Her gaze flicked pointedly to my midsection, where I had admittedly gained a few pounds during my father's illness and the stressful months that followed. Richard stepped forward, saving me from responding to Margaret's thinly veiled criticism. The property is still showing its potential, he observed, his eyes already assessing the crown molding and hardwood floors with the calculating gaze of a developer. Good bones, as they say in the business. It is excellent bones, I agreed, leading them into the living room. My great-grandfather built it to last. Built to last in 1892 isn't quite the same as built to last for the 21st century, Richard noted, running his hand along the banister of the staircase. Updating the infrastructure alone will cost a small fortune. Dad, James interjected with a warning glance, let's save the property assessments for another day, shall we? It's Thanksgiving. Richard nodded, though his expression suggested he had more to say on the topic. Of course. Where can I put the ice? And I brought a bottle of Macallan 18, thought we might need something stronger than wine today. The mention of something stronger sent another warning signal through my brain. Why would today specifically require strong liquor unless they were anticipating a difficult conversation? Before I could dwell on this, the doorbell rang again, announcing the arrival of Dunn, Kevin, and their children. The next few minutes were a flurry of greetings, coats being taken, and dishes being carried to the kitchen. Zora, at 14, immediately flopped onto the living room sofa and pulled out her phone. Tyler, 16 and going through a growth spurt that left him perpetually hungry, began inquiring about when we would eat. Let them settle in first, Tyler, Diane admonished, though she too was eyeing the kitchen with ill-concealed interest. At 40, Diane was a sharper-edged version of her mother, blonde, thin, and meticulously groomed, but with none of Margaret's attempts at social niceties. Something smells wonderful, Elena. I hope there's plenty. We skipped lunch to save room. There's more than enough, I assured her, trying not to feel insulted by the implication that I might not have prepared adequately. We should be ready to eat in about half an hour. Perfect, Diane replied, exchanging a glance with her father that seemed laden with significance. That gives us time for drinks and catching up. Kevin, a perpetually distracted-looking man whose primary passion in life seemed to be tax codes, was already deep in conversation with James about some recent regulatory change. Margaret had disappeared into the kitchen, no doubt to find a prominent place for her cauliflower rice stuffing among the traditional dishes I had prepared. I followed her, determined not to let her rearrange my carefully planned meal or my kitchen. When I entered, she was indeed opening cabinet doors, presumably looking for a serving dish for her contribution. I can help with that, I offered, moving to a specific cabinet and pulling out a small decorative bowl, just large enough for what I suspected would be an unanimously rejected side dish. Margaret smiled tightly. This seems rather modest. Perhaps something larger? I made enough for everyone. Trust me, this will be perfect, I replied, matching her smile with one of my own. The meal is already quite substantial. She conceded with a nod that didn't reach her eyes. James mentioned the inheritance came through officially. That must be a relief. There it was, the first direct mention of the money. I kept my expression neutral. Yes, everything's finalized now. Wonderful timing, she said, her voice honeyed but her gaze sharp. Sometimes things just work out for the best, don't they? Before I could respond, Richard appeared in the kitchen doorway, tumbler of scotch already in hand. "Margaret, Elena, come join us in the living room. James is about to pour champagne. We have something to celebrate." My stomach tightened. Despite James's earlier assurance that we would discuss the investment opportunity tomorrow, it seemed the announcement was proceeding as originally planned. "Champagne?" I echoed. "I don't recall buying any." "We brought it," Richard explained with a satisfied smile. "Vive Clicquot. Only the best for a momentous occasion." I followed them back to the living room, where James was indeed opening a bottle of champagne, the cork coming free with a festive pop that felt jarringly at odds with my growing sense of dread. Diane was arranging flutes on the coffee table, while Kevin herded the teenagers into the room, insisting they participate in the family moment. "What's going on?" I asked James quietly as I reached his side. He shot me a look that might have been apologetic but flashed too quickly to be certain. "Just a small celebration before dinner." "I thought we agreed to discuss this tomorrow," I hissed. "It's just an announcement," he murmured back. "The details can wait." Before I could protest further, Richard was tapping his scotch glass with a knuckle, calling for attention. "Before we sit down to this lovely meal that Elena has prepared," he began, his voice taking on the practice cadence he used at business presentations, "we wanted to share some exciting news with the whole family." All eyes turned to him, except for Zora's, which remained fixed on her phone until Diane plucked it from her hands with a stern look. "As some of you may know," Richard continued, "I've been working on a significant development opportunity in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Prime real estate, untouched natural beauty, and the potential for an exclusive luxury resort that would set new standards for the region." He gestured to James, who stepped forward, slipping an arm around my waist in a way that felt more possessive than affectionate. "What you may not know," James picked up smoothly, "is that this project is about to become a reality, thanks to a new partnership." "What you may not know," James continued smoothly, "is that this project is about to become a reality, thanks to a new partnership." He tightened his grip around my waist as if anticipating my resistance. "Elena's family inheritance has provided us with a perfect opportunity to secure the initial land purchase and begin development immediately." The room fell silent. I could feel every eye on me, gauging my reaction. My face burned with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. Despite our conversation in the kitchen, despite my clear reluctance, James had gone ahead with the announcement as planned. The champagne, the gathered family, the carefully orchestrated moment, it was all designed to back me into a corner. "I don't recall agreeing to this," I said quietly, but clearly enough for everyone to hear. James's smile faltered slightly. "Elena and I still need to iron out some details, of course," he added quickly, "but the opportunity is too perfect not to share with all of you today." "It's more than perfect," Richard chimed in, raising his glass. "It's destiny. The timing of Robert's bequest couldn't have been better orchestrated if we'd planned it ourselves." My blood ran cold at his words. The casual mention of my father's death as a convenient financial windfall struck me as profoundly callous. "My father's bequest," I said, stepping away from James's hold, "was specifically intended for the restoration of this house. That was his wish, and that's what I intend to do with it." Margaret made a small tisking sound. "Elena, dear, I understand sentimentality, truly I do. But surely Robert would want what's best for your future, not just this structure." She waved her hand dismissively at the room around us, the room where my parents had celebrated holidays, where I had grown up, where my father had spent his final months. "My father was very clear about his wishes," I replied, struggling to keep my voice steady. "The house and the money to restore it are his legacy." "Legacies can take many forms," Diane interjected, her tone practical to the point of coldness. "Dad and James have run the numbers. The potential return on investment for the resort project is exponentially higher than any increase in property value you might see from renovations." "This isn't about return on investment," I said, my frustration mounting. "It's about respecting my father's wishes and preserving a piece of history that's important to my family." "Your family is standing right here," James said quietly, a edge to his voice that I rarely heard. We're your family now, Elena, and this opportunity would benefit all of us. The implication was clear, my birth family was gone. The Morgans were my family now, and their priorities should be mine as well. The thought made me feel suddenly, profoundly alone in a room full of people. I think we should sit down to dinner, I said, desperate to escape the conversation and the expectant stares. The turkey will get cold. Just one moment, Richard said, setting down a scotch and reaching into his breast pocket. Since we're all here, I thought we might as well handle the paperwork too. No time like the present, as they say in business. He withdrew a folded document and smoothed it out on the coffee table. My stomach dropped as I recognized what it was, legal papers, likely for the transfer of funds. You brought legal documents to Thanksgiving dinner? I asked incredulously. Just being efficient, Richard replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The land seller has given us a deadline. If we don't move quickly, we could lose the opportunity altogether. I had my team draw up everything, Kevin added, speaking for the first time. Clean, straightforward transfer. We'll handle all the tax implications, of course. I stared at them all, a sense of surreal disbelief washing over me. They had planned this entire scenario, the announcement, the champagne toast, the prepared documents. They had anticipated using my inheritance for their project long before today, perhaps even before my father had died. I need some air, I said abruptly, turning toward the kitchen. Please help yourselves to appetizers. I'll be back in a moment. I retreated to the kitchen, my hands shaking as I gripped the edge of the counter. Through the window, I could see the old oak tree in the backyard, its bare branches stark against the late afternoon sky. How many times had I climbed that tree as a child, my father standing below, arms outstretched, promising to catch me if I fell. The kitchen door swung open, and James entered, his expression a mix of frustration and attempted patience. Elena, you're making a scene, he said in a low voice. Everyone's waiting. I'm making a scene? I turned to face him, no longer bothering to hide my anger. You announced plans for my inheritance without my consent. Your father brought legal documents to Thanksgiving dinner. And I'm the one making a scene? James ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I knew signaled his own mounting frustration. We discussed this earlier. I told you it was a fantastic opportunity. No, you mentioned an investment opportunity. I said I needed time to think. You agreed to discuss it tomorrow. Then you proceeded to announce it to your entire family as if it were a done deal. It is a done deal, Elena, he said, his voice hardening. The investors are lined up. The sellers are waiting. Dad has put his reputation on the line for this project. And none of that is my problem, I replied. The inheritance is mine. The decision is mine. And I'm saying no. James stared at me as if I'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. In all our years together, I had rarely directly opposed him on anything significant. I had been the accommodating one, the flexible one, the one who went along with his plans because it was easier than arguing. But this was different. This was my father's legacy. You can't say no, he said finally. This isn't just about you. It's about our future, our family. Our future? I echoed. Or your father's development company's future? Because from where I'm standing, this looks a lot more like a business opportunity for Morgan Development than a family investment. It's both, he insisted. The profits would benefit all of us, including any children we might have someday. The mention of children, again, struck me as manipulative. We had been discussing starting a family for over a year, but James always found reasons to delay. Work was too busy. The condo was too small. The timing wasn't right. Now, suddenly, hypothetical children were being used as leverage to access my inheritance. My father structured his will very specifically, I said, remembering my conversation with Sarah. The restoration fund can't legally be used for other investments. It's in a separate trust with clear stipulations. James's expression shifted subtly, a flicker of something, concern? Annoyance? Crossing his features. Legal structures can be modified with the right approach. Not this one, I replied firmly. Sarah confirmed it this morning. The money can only be used for maintaining or improving this house unless I want to trigger clauses that would redirect a significant portion to the Historical Preservation Society. You spoke to your lawyer today? He seemed genuinely surprised. Why? Because I had questions about the inheritance. Questions that seem very relevant now. James studied me for a moment, clearly recalculating his approach. When he spoke again, his tone was softer, more conciliatory. Elena, I understand you're attached to this house. It has sentimental value. But sentimentality doesn't build financial security. This isn't about financial security, I countered. We're already financially secure. You have a successful career. I have mine. We have savings, investments, retirement accounts. This is about honoring my father's wishes. Robert wouldn't want you clinging to the past, James argued. He'd want you looking to the future. Our future. Don't tell me what my father would want, I said, anger flaring again. You barely knew him. You visited him once a month during his illness? I was here every day. I know exactly what he wanted. A flash of guilt crossed James's face, quickly replaced by defensiveness. I was working. Someone had to keep earning while you took time off. To care for my dying father, I finished. Yes, James, I'm aware of the sacrifices you made. The sarcasm in my voice was unmistakable, and James's expression hardened again. I think you're being irrational. The grief is clouding your judgment. No, I said quietly. For the first time in a very long time, I think my judgment is perfectly clear. Before James could respond, the kitchen door swung open again, and Margaret appeared, her smile tight with poorly concealed impatience. Is everything all right? She asked, though her tone suggested she knew perfectly well that nothing was all right. Everyone's getting rather hungry, and Tyler is threatening to order pizza if we don't eat soon. We'll be right there, James replied, shooting me a look that clearly communicated his expectation that I would pull myself together and play along. Margaret nodded and withdrew, leaving us alone again. We need to finish this conversation later, James said in a low voice. For now, let's just get through dinner. I took a deep breath, weighing my options. I could continue arguing with James in the kitchen while a table full of people waited, or I could return to the dining room, serve the meal I had spent days preparing, and deal with the inheritance issue after our guests had departed. Fine, I agreed finally. But I'm not signing anything today, and I'm not agreeing to any investment. That's non-negotiable. James looked like he wanted to argue further but seemed to realize that pushing me now would only make things worse. He nodded curtly and held the door for me as we returned to the dining room. The atmosphere as we entered was tense despite everyone's attempts to pretend otherwise. Richard was examining the legal documents with a frown. Diane was texting someone, her fingers moving rapidly over her phone screen. The teenagers looked bored and hungry. Only Kevin seemed oblivious to the tension, happily munching on an appetizer while reading something on his tablet. Let's move to the dining room, I announced with forced cheerfulness. Everything's ready. The next half hour was consumed with the practicalities of serving a Thanksgiving meal for 8 people. The turkey needed to be carved, side dishes arranged on serving platters, drinks poured, and everyone seated. The familiar rituals provided a welcome distraction from the confrontation in the kitchen, though the underlying tension remained. As we finally settled around the table, the spread before us was impressive despite the circumstances: a golden brown turkey, creamy mashed potatoes, rich gravy, sweet potato casserole, green bean casserole, homemade cranberry sauce, and my mother's recipe for cornbread stuffing. Margaret's cauliflower rice creation sat in its small dish, looking pale and unappetizing next to the traditional fare. Richard cleared his throat as everyone began passing dishes. Perhaps we should say grace, he suggested, though the Morgans had never been a particularly religious family in my experience. Before anyone could respond, he bowed his head and launched into a prayer that quickly became more of a business presentation than an expression of gratitude. Lord, we thank you for this food and for the opportunities you have provided. We are especially grateful for new beginnings and the chance to create something lasting for future generations. Guide us as we embark on this new venture together as a family. Bless this meal and the decisions we make today. Amen. A murmured chorus of amens followed, though I remained silent, unwilling to participate in what felt like a manipulation of religious tradition for financial gain. As plates were filled and food began to be consumed, Richard tried again to steer the conversation toward the resort project. "Elena, I understand your hesitation," he began, his tone reasonable and measured. "Change can be frightening, especially when emotions are involved. But I think if you look at the prospectus, could we please just enjoy the meal?" I interrupted, unable to maintain the pretense of normalcy any longer. "It's Thanksgiving. Can we focus on being thankful rather than business opportunities?" "The two aren't mutually exclusive," Richard countered smoothly. "I'm thankful for this business opportunity." Diane nodded in agreement. "The location is absolutely perfect, Elena. You should see the market analysis. The demand for luxury accommodations in that area far exceeds the current supply." "I've made my position clear," I said firmly. "I'm not interested in discussing it further today." An uncomfortable silence descended on the table, broken only by the sound of cutlery against plates. Finally, Tyler, bless his teenage obliviousness, spoke up. "This turkey is amazing," he declared, already working on a second helping. "Way better than last year when we went to that restaurant and they served those weird rolled-up turkey things." "Turkey roulades," Margaret corrected with a sigh. "They were a modern interpretation of a classic dish." "They were gross," Zora chimed in, momentarily looking up from her phone, which she had managed to sneak back to the table despite her mother's earlier confiscation. "This is way better." I smiled gratefully at the teenagers. "Thank you. It's my mother's recipe. She used to brine the turkey overnight with herbs and citrus." "Your mother was certainly a traditional cook," Margaret observed, the word traditional carrying an unmistakable hint of condescension, though these days many people are moving away from such heavy holiday meals. "My cauliflower rice stuffing has only a quarter of the calories of conventional stuffing." "Which explains why no one's eating it," Zora muttered, just loudly enough to be heard. "Zora," Diane admonished, though I caught a flicker of amusement in her eyes. For all her business-minded seriousness, Diane had always had a streak of blunt honesty that occasionally pierced through her polished exterior. The conversation mercifully shifted to more neutral topics: the teenagers' school activities, Kevin's recent golf tournament, a charity gala that Margaret was helping to organize. James remained unusually quiet, contributing only when directly addressed, his expression thoughtful as he watched the interactions around the table. As the meal progressed, I found myself observing the Morgan family with new eyes. Had they always been this focused on status and financial gain? Had they always viewed relationships as transactions, opportunities as assets, and emotions as inconvenient obstacles? Or was I only seeing it clearly now because they were targeting something I valued deeply? By the time dessert was served, pumpkin pie with freshly whipped cream and a pecan pie that had been my father's favorite, the earlier tension had subsided somewhat, replaced by the satisfied lethargy that follows a large meal. Even Richard seemed to have temporarily set aside his resort plans, engaging Tyler in a conversation about college prospects instead. As I served coffee to accompany the dessert, I allowed myself to hope that perhaps the worst of the day was behind us. Maybe James and his family had recognized my determination and would respect my decision, even if they didn't agree with it. That hope was shattered as Richard set down his coffee cup and once again reached into his jacket pocket. "Now that we've enjoyed Elena's wonderful meal," he began, "I think it's time to revisit our earlier discussion. The resort opportunity won't wait forever." James shot his father a warning look. "Dad, I don't think this is the right time." "There's no better time than when family is gathered," Richard insisted, smoothing out the documents on the table beside his dessert plate. "The seller needs an answer by Monday. That gives us very little time to finalize the details." I set down my own coffee cup with a bit more force than necessary. "Richard, I've already made my position clear. I'm not investing my inheritance in the resort project." "You haven't even read the prospectus," he countered, pushing a glossy folder toward me. At least look at the projections before making a final decision. My decision is final, I replied calmly. The inheritance was left to me for a specific purpose, and I intend to honor that purpose. Richard's expression hardened, his business-friendly veneer slipping. This is short-sighted and selfish. We're talking about a multi-generational opportunity. Your house renovation benefits no one but you. It benefits the historical character of the neighborhood, I countered. It preserves a piece of architectural heritage. And most importantly, it respects my father's wishes. Your father is dead, Richard said bluntly. You're clinging to the past at the expense of your future, and the future of the entire Morgan family. The table fell silent. Even the teenagers looked uncomfortable at the harshness of Richard's statement. Dad, James said quietly, that's enough. But Richard wasn't finished. No, it's not enough. We have investors waiting, plans drawn up, projections completed. This isn't just some whim, it's a carefully calculated business opportunity that would set all of us up for life, and Elena is blocking it because of sentimentality over an old house that's falling apart. It's my inheritance, I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil I felt. My decision. And my answer is no. Richard turned to James, his expression incredulous. Control your wife. Make her see reason. Control me? I repeated, anger flaring hot and bright. I'm not a child or a pet to be controlled. I'm an equal partner in this marriage, clearly not equal when it comes to financial decisions, Margaret interjected. James has always had the better head for business. You should defer to his judgment in these matters. I stared at her, momentarily speechless. In all our years of marriage, I had never realized that my in-laws viewed me as subordinate to James, someone who should defer rather than decide. I think, I said carefully, that it's time for this dinner to end. Elena, James began, but I cut him off with a look. No, James. Your parents have made their position perfectly clear. They see me as someone to be controlled and my inheritance as a resource to be exploited. I won't sit here and be insulted in my own home, my family home. Now you're being dramatic, Diane sighed. This is a straightforward business discussion. At Thanksgiving dinner, I pointed out. With legal documents prepared in advance. That doesn't strike me as straightforward at all. It strikes me as calculated and manipulative. Kevin, who had remained largely silent throughout the meal, finally spoke up. The timing is unfortunate, I'll grant you that. But the opportunity is genuine, Elena. I've reviewed all the financials myself. I don't care if it's genuine, I replied. It's not what my father wanted for his legacy, and it's not what I want either. Richard stood, gathering his documents with sharp, angry movements. This is ridiculous. We've wasted months of planning because you can't see past your emotional attachment to a pile of old wood and plaster. Dad, James warned again, his expression unreadable. But Richard was beyond warnings. No, I'm done tiptoeing around this. Either she signs the transfer documents by Monday, or the deal is dead. And with it, any chance of the Morgan family participating in what would have been the most significant development opportunity in the region. He turned to me, his expression cold. Think carefully about your decision, Elena. This isn't just about you. It's about your future with this family. The threat was thinly veiled but unmistakable. My compliance with their financial plans was being directly linked to my acceptance in the family. I think you should leave, I said quietly. Margaret gasped. You're asking us to leave? On Thanksgiving? Yes, I confirmed, standing as well. I've been insulted, manipulated, and threatened. I think that's more than enough holiday celebration for one day. The next few minutes passed in a blur of tense goodbyes and hurried departures. Diane and Kevin gathered their children, who looked more intrigued than upset by the dramatic turn of events. Margaret collected her barely touched cauliflower rice creation, muttering about ingratitude. Richard stalked to the car without a backward glance, the rejected documents clutched in his hand. Soon, only James and I remained in the suddenly quiet house. The table was still laden with half-eaten desserts and cooling coffee. The kitchen was a disaster of cooking utensils and dirty pots. But all of that seemed irrelevant compared to the chasm that had opened between us during the course of the day. James stood in the living room, staring out the window as his family's SUVs pulled away from the curb. When he finally turned to face me, his expression was a complex mixture of anger, frustration, and something that might have been regret. "Well," he said quietly, "that didn't go as planned." "No," I agreed. "It didn't. Though I'm curious what exactly was planned." "For me to be so overwhelmed by your family's pressure that I'd simply sign away my inheritance on the spot?" James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It wasn't supposed to be like that. Dad went too far. He's passionate about this project, we all are. Passionate enough to prepare legal documents and bring them to Thanksgiving dinner," I observed. "Passionate enough to threaten my place in the family if I don't comply." "He didn't mean it that way," James protested, though his defense lacked conviction. "He's under a lot of pressure from the investors." "And that's supposed to be my problem?" I asked. "I should give up my inheritance, disregard my father's wishes, because your father has made promises to investors about money that isn't his?" James moved to the sofa and sat heavily, looking suddenly tired. "Elena, try to understand. This resort project isn't just another development for Dad. It's his legacy project, the one he wants to be remembered for. He's been working on it for years, waiting for the right location, the right investors, the right moment, and the right financing," I added. "Namely, my inheritance." He had the grace to look uncomfortable. "The opportunity and the timing of your inheritance coinciding was fortunate." "Fortunate," I repeated. "Is that what you call it?" "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you and your family have been planning to use my inheritance for this project from the moment my father's diagnosis became terminal." James's expression confirmed my suspicion before he could formulate a denial. It was a momentary flicker of guilt, quickly suppressed, but it was enough. "How long?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "How long have you been planning this?" He hesitated, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he sighed. "Dad bought the property about a year ago. The initial discussions with investors began shortly after." "A year ago," I repeated. "When my father's condition worsened. When it became clear he wasn't going to recover." "It wasn't like that," James insisted. "We didn't know the details of your inheritance then. We just knew there would likely be some assets passed to you. And you immediately began making plans for those assets," I finished for him. "Without consulting me, without considering my feelings or my father's wishes. We considered the best financial use of the resources," James argued. "That's what families do, they make the most of what they have for the benefit of everyone." "No, James," I said, shaking my head, "that's not what families do. Families respect each other's autonomy. They support each other's values and wishes. They don't manipulate and pressure each other into financial decisions." "You're being idealistic," he scoffed. "Real families deal with money pragmatically. They maximize assets and minimize sentimentality." I stared at him, truly seeing him for perhaps the first time in our marriage. "Is that how you've always viewed our relationship? As a pragmatic financial arrangement?" James looked exasperated. "Of course not. I love you. But love doesn't pay bills or secure futures. Smart financial decisions do. My father left me more than enough to secure my future," I pointed out. "Our future. The inheritance isn't about financial security, it's about preserving something meaningful, something with history and personal significance." "It's a house, Elena," James said dismissively. "Just a house. One that's costing more to maintain every year, one that will drain that inheritance with repairs and updates until there's nothing left." "It's not just a house," I insisted. "It's my history. It's the place where I grew up, where my parents lived, where generations of my family made memories." "Memories that are in your heart, not in the floorboards," James countered. "You don't need this physical structure to honor those memories." I shook my head, realizing that he truly didn't understand or didn't want to understand. This isn't a philosophical debate, James. It's about respecting my decision about my inheritance. A decision that affects both of us, he reminded me. Whatever you inherit becomes our joint asset. That's how marriage works. Not legally, in this case, I replied. My father's trust was very specific. The house and restoration fund are solely in my name, with legal protections that prevent exactly what you and your family are trying to do. James's expression darkened. So you're saying what's yours is yours, but what's mine is ours. That's not much of a partnership. I've never tried to control your financial decisions, I pointed out. I've never demanded you redirect your investments or savings according to my preferences. All I'm asking is the same respect in return. This is different, he insisted. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. For your father's company, I clarified. Not necessarily for us. James stood and began pacing the living room, his movements sharp with frustration. They're the same thing. The company is family. The family is the company. Success for one is success for all. And that's the crux of the problem, I said quietly. In your family, business and personal relationships are inseparable. Money and love are intertwined. I don't see the world that way, and I don't want to live that way. He stopped pacing and stared at me. What are you saying? I took a deep breath, the weight of the realization settling over me like a physical burden. I'm saying that today has shown me that we have fundamentally different values. You see my inheritance as a financial resource to be optimized. I see it as a personal legacy to be honored. And you can't see any room for compromise? He asked, his tone softening slightly. What if we used just part of the inheritance for the resort, enough to secure our place in the project, but leaving some for the house renovations? I shook my head. It's not about the amount, James. It's about the principle. My father left this money for a specific purpose, and I intend to honor that purpose. Besides, the trust structure doesn't allow for partial redirection of funds. Trusts can be modified, he persisted. Kevin knows people who specialize in that kind of legal work. I don't want to modify it, I said firmly. I agree with my father's wishes. This house deserves to be preserved, and that's what I'm going to do with the inheritance. James's expression hardened again. Even if it costs you your marriage? The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications. Was he truly making my compliance with his family's financial scheme a condition of our continued relationship? Are you giving me an ultimatum? I asked carefully. He hesitated, perhaps realizing how his question had sounded. No, not an ultimatum. I'm just pointing out that this decision has serious consequences for our future together. Because you're choosing to make it that way, I observed. You're the one linking my inheritance decision to the state of our marriage. My father has staked a lot on this project, James said, his voice tight with tension. If we can't contribute as planned, it creates a serious rift in the family. That affects us whether you want it to or not. So I'm supposed to sacrifice my father's legacy to preserve peace in your family? I asked incredulously. That seems like a rather one-sided expectation. James ran both hands through his hair in frustration. You're twisting my words. I'm trying to find a solution that works for everyone. No, I contradicted him gently. You're trying to find a way to get what you and your family want while making me feel like I'm being unreasonable for refusing. That's not the same thing. He stared at me for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. You've changed, he said finally. Since your father died. You've become harder, less flexible. I've become clearer about what matters to me, I corrected him. And more willing to stand up for it. That's not the same as becoming harder. It is when it puts you in direct opposition to your husband's family, he countered. I didn't create this opposition, I reminded him. Your family did, by making plans for my inheritance without consulting me and then trying to pressure me into complying. James shook his head, his frustration evident. I don't know how to fix this. Dad needs an answer by Monday. The seller won't wait longer than that. There's nothing to fix, I said quietly. My answer is no. It will still be no on Monday. Richard will need to find alternative financing for his resort project. He's exhausted all other options, James admitted. Your inheritance was the perfect solution because it was family money, no investor demands or bank terms to satisfy. Just my terms, I pointed out. Which apparently count for less than external investors would have. James had no response to that, the truth of it too evident to deny. Instead, he checked his watch and sighed. I need to go for a drive, he said abruptly. Clear my head. On Thanksgiving evening? I asked, surprised. We had always spent the holiday evenings together, usually watching classic movies and eating leftover pie. Yes, he said firmly. I need some space to think. Don't wait up. Before I could respond, he grabbed his keys and headed for the door, leaving me alone in the house that had become the center of so much conflict. I stood in the middle of the living room, surrounded by the remnants of our disastrous Thanksgiving dinner. The beautiful meal I had prepared with such care had ended in arguments and ultimatums. The family gathering I had hosted in my childhood home had revealed the true nature of my in-laws' regard for me and my inheritance. And my marriage, which I had believed was based on mutual respect and affection, had shown its fault lines under pressure. James had made it clear where his primary loyalty lay, with his family's financial ambitions, not with my wishes regarding my own inheritance. I moved to the window, watching as James's car pulled away from the curb and disappeared down the street. For the first time since my father's death, I felt a strange sense of clarity amidst the pain. The day's events had stripped away pretenses and revealed hard truths about my marriage and my place in the Morgan family. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. A text from Maya. Hope the Morgan invasion wasn't too painful. Call me if you need to talk. I smiled despite everything. Maya knew me too well. I thought about calling her immediately to pour out the whole sordid story, but something held me back. I needed time to process it all myself first, to understand what it meant for my future, a future that suddenly seemed far less certain than it had this morning. Instead, I texted back, they left early. Long story. We'll call tomorrow. Then I set down my phone and headed to the kitchen. The dishes wouldn't wash themselves, and the familiar routine of cleanup would give me time to think. As I filled the sink with soapy water and began to scrape plates, I found myself glancing around the kitchen, at the worn countertops my father had installed himself decades ago, at the slightly crooked cabinet doors, at the antique light fixture that had illuminated family dinners for generations. This house wasn't just a structure of wood and plaster, as James had dismissively described it. It was a repository of memories, a physical connection to my past, a legacy entrusted to me by my father. And I was more determined than ever to honor that trust, regardless of the cost to my relationship with the Morgan family, or even to my marriage. As I washed my mother's china and carefully dried each piece, I realized that today had been a turning point. The comfortable life I had built with James over 6 years had revealed its fragility in the face of financial pressure and family loyalty. The man I had married had shown himself willing to dismiss my feelings and my father's wishes in pursuit of a business opportunity. By the time I finished cleaning the kitchen, it was past midnight, and James had not returned. I made my way upstairs to the bedroom where I had slept as a child and where we had both slept since my father's death. As I prepared for bed alone, I wondered if James would come home tonight at all, or if he had sought refuge with his parents, planning their next move in the campaign to access my inheritance. The thought should have frightened me, the prospect of my marriage unraveling over this conflict. Instead, I felt a strange sense of peace as I slept between the sheets. Whatever happened next, I knew I was standing on solid ground, protecting something truly valuable. My father would have understood, and ultimately, that mattered more to me than the Morgan family's approval or even James's support. As I drifted toward sleep, I found myself recalling something my father had said to me during one of our final conversations. The true test of any relationship, Elena, is what happens when money enters the picture. It has a way of revealing people's true priorities. Today, those priorities had been revealed with painful clarity. The question now was what I would do with that knowledge, but that was a decision for tomorrow. Tonight, in my childhood home, Surrounded by the ghosts of my past and the uncertainty of my future, I would simply rest and gather my strength for whatever came next. Because one thing was certain, the battle over my inheritance was far from over. The Morgan family wasn't accustomed to failure, and James wasn't accustomed to me saying no. I woke to the sound of a car door closing. The digital clock on my nightstand read 6:37 a.m. Sunlight had just begun to filter through the curtains, casting long shadows across the bedroom floor. I lay still, listening to the front door open and close, followed by the familiar cadence of James's footsteps in the hallway below. He hadn't come home last night. The realization settled over me like a cold weight. In 6 years of marriage, we had never spent a night apart due to an argument. James had always insisted on resolving conflicts before bed, often pushing for resolutions that, in retrospect, usually favored his position. But last night had been different. Last night, I had held firm to my decision about the inheritance, and he had chosen to leave rather than accept it. I heard him moving around downstairs, the clink of a coffee mug, the rush of water from the tap, the soft thud of the refrigerator door closing. Normal, domestic sounds that now felt strangely discordant with the tension hanging between us. Part of me wanted to stay in bed, to postpone the inevitable confrontation. But I had never been one to hide from difficult conversations, and putting this off wouldn't make it any easier. I slipped out of bed, pulled on my robe, and made my way downstairs. James sat at the kitchen table, a steaming mug of coffee in front of him, his expression weary. He looked up as I entered, his eyes shadowed from what had clearly been a sleepless night. "You're back," I said softly, stating the obvious because I couldn't think of a better opening. "Yes." His voice was rough with fatigue. "We need to talk." I nodded, moving to pour myself a cup of coffee before joining him at the table. The kitchen was still immaculate from my late-night cleaning, no evidence remaining of yesterday's disastrous dinner except for the lingering scent of turkey and spices. "Where did you go?" I asked, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. "My parents at first," he admitted. "Then I drove around for a while. Ended up at the office, slept on the couch there." I nodded again, unsurprised. "And did you and your parents come up with a new strategy to access my inheritance, or have you accepted my decision?" The question was more pointed than I had intended, but the events of yesterday had stripped away my usual diplomatic approach. James winced. "That's not fair, Elena." "Isn't it?" I countered. "Your family ambushed me on Thanksgiving with prepared legal documents and champagne to celebrate my capitulation. When I refused, your father threatened my place in the family, and you chose to leave rather than stand by me. What part of that assessment isn't fair?" He ran a hand through his disheveled hair, a gesture of frustration I had seen countless times throughout our marriage. "You're right," he conceded, surprising me. "Yesterday was inappropriate. Dad took the wrong approach, and I should have stopped it sooner." "Yes, you should have," I agreed. "But the approach isn't the real issue here, James. The issue is that you and your family made plans for my inheritance without consulting me, and you expected me to simply go along with them." "I didn't just expect you to go along," he protested. "I thought once you understood the opportunity, you'd want to participate. This resort could be incredibly successful, Elena. It could secure our financial future for decades." "Our financial future is already secure," I reminded him. "We both have good careers, savings, investments. We're not struggling." "There's a difference between not struggling and truly prospering," he argued. "This project could be transformative, not just financially, but for our standing in the community, our legacy." I studied him across the table, noticing the animation that entered his expression when he spoke about the resort. This wasn't just about money. It was about status, recognition, validation. Things the Morgan family had always valued highly. "James," I said carefully, "I understand this project is important to you and your family. But my inheritance is important to me. My father left it with explicit instructions, and I intend to honor them." He looked down at his coffee. "Even if it damages our marriage?" There it was again, the implication that my refusal to surrender my inheritance was the problem, rather than his expectation that I should. I'm not the one making this a condition of our marriage, I pointed out. You are. He looked up, his expression hardening slightly. It's not that simple. This project is crucial to Dad's company. He's staked his reputation on it. If it falls through because you refuse to contribute, it creates a permanent rift, and that's more important than respecting my wishes? Than honoring my father's memory? James sighed, a sound of genuine fatigue. No, of course not. But families are complicated, Elena. Sometimes compromises are necessary. What compromise have you or your family offered? I asked. All I've heard are demands that I surrender my entire inheritance to your father's project. He had no answer to that, at least none that he seemed willing to voice. After a moment of silence, he tried a different approach. What about a middle ground? We use half the inheritance for the resort investment, half for the house renovation. That way, both priorities are addressed. I shook my head. First, as I told you yesterday, the trust is structured in a way that prevents that kind of division. And second, that's not a compromise, it's just a smaller version of what you originally demanded. What would you consider a compromise, then? He asked, his frustration evident. I don't think there is one in the situation, I replied honestly. The inheritance was left for a specific purpose. Using it for anything else would be disrespecting my father's wishes. James stood abruptly, carrying his coffee to the sink and pouring it out with more force than necessary. So that's it? No discussion, no flexibility? We can discuss how to move forward from here, I offered. But not how to redirect my inheritance. The decision is made. He turned to face me, leaning against the counter. You realize what this means for our relationship with my family? I do, I acknowledged. And I'm sorry for that. But I'm not responsible for the expectations your father created with his investors, or for the pressure he's now facing. That was his choice, made without my knowledge or consent. James was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke, his voice quieter but firm. Monday is the deadline for the land purchase. If we can't secure the financing by then, the deal fails, and the investors will likely pull out entirely. I understand, I said simply. And you're still saying no? I'm still saying no. He nodded slowly, as if confirming something to himself. Then I need to go tell my father. He deserves to hear it directly, not wait until the last minute hoping you'll change your mind. That's fair, I agreed, relieved that he seemed to be accepting my decision, even if reluctantly. I'll be back later, he said, straightening from the counter. We'll need to talk more about what this means for us. The implicit warning in his words was clear, but I refused to let it shake my resolve. I'll be here. After James left, I sat alone at the kitchen table, trying to process the events of the past 24 hours. Thanksgiving Day had begun with the simple goal of hosting a family dinner in my childhood home. Now, less than a day later, the foundations of my marriage had been shaken, my relationship with my in-laws possibly damaged beyond repair, and my husband had all but threatened that our future together hinged on my financial compliance. I pulled out my phone and called the one person I knew would understand. Elena? Maya answered, her voice still rough with sleep. Everything okay? No, I admitted. Not even close. Can you come over? I need to talk. Give me 30 minutes, she replied without hesitation, the sounds of her already moving evident in the background. And coffee. Strong coffee. When Maya arrived, looking casual but put together in jeans and a sweater despite the early hour, I had a fresh pot of coffee waiting and leftover pumpkin pie set out on the kitchen table. Some problems were too big to face without sugar. Okay, she said after I had recounted the entire Thanksgiving disaster, from James's initial revelation about the resort plans to his early morning ultimatum. Let me get this straight. Your in-laws expected you to sign over your entire inheritance, the house and restoration fund your father specifically left you, for a resort development project they've been planning behind your back for a year? That's the short version, yes, I confirmed, pushing my half-eaten slice of pie round my plate. And when you refused, Richard basically threatened to ostracize you from the family, and James implied your marriage might not survive your decision. I nodded, the reality of it sounding even more outrageous when summarized so succinctly. Maya set down her coffee mug with a decisive thud. Elena, I've never liked your in-laws, you know that. I've always thought they were elitist and materialistic. But this goes beyond that. This is manipulative and controlling behavior. I know, I sighed. The thing is, I'm not even surprised by Richard and Margaret. They've always been this way, just usually more subtle about it. What hurts is James's response. He's my husband. He's supposed to support me, especially when it comes to honoring my father's legacy. Has he always sided with his parents over you? Maya asked carefully. I considered the question, thinking back over our 6 years of marriage. Not in such obvious ways, I said finally, but in retrospect, yes, their priorities have usually taken precedence. James has always been deferential to his father's opinions and expectations. And you've always been accommodating, Maya observed, not unkindly. Until now. Until now, I agreed. This is different. This is my father's legacy, his final wish. I can't just give that up because the Morgans have a better use for the money. You shouldn't have to, Maya said firmly, and any husband worth keeping would understand that. Her words hung in the air between us, giving voice to the question I had been avoiding since James left this morning. Was our marriage worth saving if it required me to sacrifice my own values and my father's wishes? I don't know what to do, I admitted, the words emerging as little more than a whisper. I love James. We've built a life together. But I can't give in on this, and I'm not sure he can accept that. Maya reached across the table to squeeze my hand. Then maybe this is the universe's way of showing you who he really is before you invest more years in the relationship. Better to find out now than 10 years from now when you might have children involved. Children. The topic that James had used twice now to manipulate me regarding the inheritance. How strange that we had been discussing starting a family for over a year with no progress, yet suddenly hypothetical children were being invoked as beneficiaries of his father's resort project. You're right, I said, squeezing Maya's hand in return. I just need to stay strong and see this through, whatever the outcome. And you won't be alone, she assured me. No matter what happens with James and the Morgans, you have people who care about you and who respect your decisions. Her words were exactly what I needed to hear. Despite the uncertainty ahead, I wasn't alone. I had friends, I had support, and most importantly, I had the confidence that I was honoring my father's wishes. After Maya left, promising to check in later, I spent the morning tackling the house's most urgent maintenance issues. The distraction of physical labor was welcome, changing air filters, recalking a leaky bathroom sink, replacing the weather stripping on the back door. These small acts of care for my family home felt symbolic, a tangible commitment to the promise I had made to my father. Around noon, my phone rang. Sarah Wilson, my attorney. Elena, she greeted me, her tone professional but warm. I wanted to check in. You mentioned yesterday that there might be some pressure regarding the inheritance. I hadn't told her the specifics of the situation with James and his family, only that I had concerns about potential claims on the trust. Yes, I confirmed, setting down my screwdriver and sitting on the edge of the bathtub where I had been working. The situation has escalated. My husband's family wants to use the inheritance, both the house and the restoration fund, for a business venture. They brought legal documents to Thanksgiving dinner, expecting me to sign. Sarah's sharp intake of breath conveyed her professional disapproval. That's highly irregular. Did you sign anything? No, I assured her, and I've made it clear I have no intention of doing so. That they're persistent, and my husband seems to believe my refusal might be grounds for reconsidering our marriage. There was a brief silence on the line. Elena, I don't normally give personal advice to clients, but in this case, I think it's necessary. You need to protect yourself, not just legally, but financially. If your husband is linking your compliance about the inheritance to the status of your marriage, you should prepare for the possibility that he might take more drastic steps. The suggestion sent a chill through me. What kind of steps? In my experience, Sarah said carefully, when substantial assets are involved and one spouse refuses to cooperate with family financial plans, things can get complicated. Joint accounts are emptied. Credit lines are maxed out. Debts are incurred. Not saying this will happen in your case, but I've seen it too many times to dismiss the possibility. I thought of our shared checking and savings accounts, the joint credit cards, the investment portfolio we had built together. All potentially vulnerable if James decided to retaliate for my refusal to surrender the inheritance. What should I do? I asked, the gravity of the situation settling over me. First, secure your personal finances, Sarah advised. Open accounts in your name only and transfer a reasonable portion of your joint assets. Not everything, that could be seen as financial abandonment, but enough to protect yourself in the short term. Second, document everything. If your husband or his family make threats or demands regarding the inheritance, record it if legal in your state, or at minimum, take contemporaneous notes with dates and times. And third, she continued, consider consulting with a family law attorney. I can give you some names of colleagues I respect. This isn't about filing for divorce, it's about understanding your options and protections if the situation deteriorates further. The practical advice helped ground me, giving me concrete steps to take rather than just worry. Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate your candor. That's what you pay me for, she replied with a hint of dry humor. The trust your father established is solid. Legally, your husband and his family have no claim on those assets. But personal relationships are another matter entirely, and it's important you protect yourself on all fronts. After ending the call, I sat motionless for several minutes, absorbing Sarah's advice and its implications. The situation had evolved from a family disagreement to potential legal preparation for the dissolution of my marriage. The reality of that was both terrifying and strangely clarifying. I spent the next few hours following Sarah's advice, opening new accounts, transferring funds, documenting the events of Thanksgiving and this morning's conversation with James. I also gathered important documents, my birth certificate, passport, the deed to the house, the trust paperwork, and placed him in a secure location outside our shared safe. By late afternoon, I had done all I could to protect myself financially and legally. Now I just had to prepare emotionally for James's return and whatever ultimatum might accompany it. The sun was beginning to set when I heard his key in the front door. I was in the living room, curled in my father's old armchair with a book I hadn't actually been reading. James entered, looking haggard, his normally impeccable appearance rumpled from what had clearly been a difficult day. How did it go with your father? I asked, setting aside the book. James dropped his keys on the side table with a clatter. About as well as you'd expect. He's furious. The deal is officially dead. The seller won't extend the deadline, and the primary investors are already talking about pulling out entirely. I'm sorry, I said, and despite everything, I meant it. I took no pleasure in Richard's business failure, even if it was a consequence of his own presumptuous planning. Are you? James asked, his tone sharp, because from where I'm standing, you seem perfectly content to watch my family's biggest opportunity collapse rather than compromise on your inheritance. That's not fair, I protested. I didn't create this situation. Your father made promises based on money that wasn't his to give. That's not my responsibility. Family is about shared responsibility, he countered. Your inheritance could have benefited all of us. Instead, it will be drained away maintaining an outdated house that should have been sold years ago. His dismissal of my childhood home, the house my father had loved and specifically left to me, reignited my anger. This house has been in my family for 4 generations. It has history and meaning that can't be replaced. The resort project was just another business venture. Just another business venture? James repeated incredulously. It was the culmination of my father's career, his legacy project. Now he'll retire with a failure hanging over him, all because you couldn't see past your sentimentality. My sentimentality, I echoed. Is that how you see my desire to honor my father's wishes? As an emotional weakness rather than a principled choice? James moved further into the room, his posture rigid with tension. I see it as a choice that has now created a permanent rift between you and my family, a choice that has undermined my position with my father and jeopardized my career prospects within the company. So this is about your career now? I asked, finally understanding a piece of the puzzle that had been missing. You were expecting some role in the resort project? Some advancement within your father's company? His silence was confirmation enough. James, I said, realization dawning. Did you take the investment job at your current firm because that's what you wanted, or because your father thought it would be useful for you to have that experience before joining Morgan Development? What does it matter? He asked defensively. It was a good career move either way. It matters because I'm trying to understand how much of our life together has been shaped by your father's expectations and plans. I explained. How many of our decisions have actually been his decisions that you've implemented? That's ridiculous, James scoffed. I make my own choices. Do you? I challenged gently. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like your father has been orchestrating your career path, and now you're angry with me for disrupting his plans for your future. James paced the living room, his movements jerky with agitation. You don't understand how my family works. Dad has connections, influence. His approval opens doors that would otherwise remain closed. That's not control, it's opportunity. It's both, I countered. And it comes with the expectation that you'll prioritize family business interests above everything else, including your wife's wishes and her father's legacy. He stopped pacing to face me directly. My father has built something meaningful, a successful company, financial security, respect in the community. When he offers guidance, it's based on decades of experience and success. I don't doubt that, I acknowledged. But that doesn't give him the right to make decisions about my inheritance or to expect me to sacrifice my father's wishes for his business interests. James ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that had become almost a nervous tic over the course of our confrontations. Where does that leave us? He asked finally. You've made your position clear. You won't change your mind about the inheritance. My family considers that a betrayal. I'm caught in the middle. Are you? I asked quietly. Because from everything you've said, it sounds like you're firmly on their side. You've defended their actions, adopted their perspective, and blamed me for the consequences of their presumptuous planning. That's not, he began, then stopped, perhaps recognizing the truth in my assessment. After a moment, he tried again. I love you, Elena, but my family is important to me too. I can't just cut ties with them because of one disagreement. I've never asked you to cut ties with them, I pointed out. I've only asked you to respect my decision about my own inheritance. There's a difference. Not to them, he said grimly. To my father, loyalty is absolute. You're either with the family or against it. And where do you stand in that binary? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. James looked away, unable to meet my eyes. I need time to think, to figure out how to navigate this situation. That's not an answer, I observed. It's the only one I have right now, he replied, an edge of frustration in his voice. This isn't simple, Elena. You're asking me to choose between my wife and my family of origin. No, I corrected him gently. Your family is asking you to choose. I'm simply asking you to respect my decision about my own inheritance. If that creates a conflict with your family, that's their choice, not mine. He shook his head, unwilling or unable to see the distinction. I can't stay here tonight. I need space to clear my head. Where will you go? I asked, though I was fairly certain I knew the answer to that question too. My parents, he confirmed. Just for a few days while I sort things out. The irony wasn't lost on me, claiming to need space to decide between his wife and his family, while immediately seeking refuge with the latter. But I chose not to point this out. James's choice of sanctuary was itself a kind of answer, even if he wasn't ready to acknowledge it. Take whatever time you need, I said instead. But James, I want to be clear about something. My decision about the inheritance isn't going to change. If you're hoping that time apart will make me more willing to compromise on this issue, you'll be disappointed. He nodded stiffly. I understand. And one more thing, I added as he turned to leave. I've transferred some of our joint assets to accounts in my name only. Not everything, just enough to protect myself in case the situation becomes more adversarial. I'm telling you this directly because I want to be transparent, even if we are at odds right now. James froze, his expression shifting from surprise to hurt to anger in rapid succession. You've already separated our finances? Were you planning to tell me if I hadn't decided to leave? Yes, I confirmed. And it was on the advice of my attorney, given the pressure your family has been applying and the threats, subtle and otherwise, that have been made regarding my place in the family if I don't comply with your father's plans. So you're preparing for divorce, he said flatly. You've consulted a lawyer and separated assets. Sounds like you've already made your decision about our marriage. I'm preparing to protect myself, I corrected him. There's a difference. Whether this leads to divorce depends largely on you and what you decide is most important to you, your father's approval or our marriage as equal partners who respect each other's autonomy. James's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching visibly. I'll get some clothes, he said curtly, heading for the stairs without further comment. As he packed, I remained in the living room, a peculiar calm settling over me despite the turmoil of the situation. In the space of 2 days, my life had been upended, my marriage revealed as conditional, my place in my husband's family contingent on financial compliance, my future suddenly uncertain. Yet beneath the sadness and disappointment, I felt something unexpected, relief. The constant, subtle pressure to conform to Morgan family expectations I had never fully embraced but had accommodated for the sake of harmony, had finally been exposed for what it was. The pretense had fallen away, revealing the transactional nature of what I had thought was acceptance and affection. James returned downstairs with a suitcase, his expression closed and distant. I'll be in touch, he said stiffly. We obviously have things to discuss once I've had time to think. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Despite everything, watching him prepare to leave our home, my home, was painful. Whatever happened next, something fundamental had broken between us, and I wasn't sure it could ever be repaired. After he left, the house felt both emptier and somehow more peaceful. I moved through the rooms, straightening cushions, adjusting picture frames, small acts of care for the space my father had entrusted to me. In the study, I paused before the portrait of my parents on their wedding day, my mother radiant in a simple white dress, my father beaming with pride and joy beside her. I'm keeping my promise, I told them softly. The house will stay in the family. It will be restored, just as Dad wanted. That night, alone in my childhood bedroom, I slept more soundly than I had in months. Whatever challenges lay ahead, the potential dissolution of my marriage, the hostility of the Morgan family, the practicalities of life as a single woman again, I faced them with the certainty that I was honoring my father's legacy and staying true to my own values. Some prices were too high to pay for harmony, and surrendering my father's carefully planned bequest to satisfy my husband's family's greed was one of them. If James couldn't understand that, perhaps we had never truly known each other at all. The inheritance had become a test, not just of the Morgan family's respect for me, but of James's commitment to our marriage as a partnership of equals rather than an extension of his family's business interests. He had failed that test spectacularly, revealing priorities that had perhaps always been there but had never before been so nakedly exposed. As I drifted toward sleep, I thought about my father's words again: money can build new houses, but it can't build new memories. It can't create history. The Morgan family had never understood the value of history or memory, only the value of assets and opportunities. In their world, my inheritance was simply capital to be deployed for maximum financial return. In my world, the world my father had taught me to value, it was a legacy to be preserved, a history to be honored. The gulf between those perspectives might prove unbridgeable. And if so, perhaps it was better to discover that now, before children and deeper entanglements made separation even more painful. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, but tonight, in my family home, surrounded by the history that 4 generations had built, I knew I had made the right choice, the only choice that would allow me to look in the mirror and recognize the woman my father had raised to value integrity over convenience, principle over profit, and family legacy over financial opportunity. Whatever the cost, that was a price worth paying. The next morning dawned clear and cold, sunlight streaming through the frost-patterned windows of my bedroom. For a moment, in the hazy space between sleep and wakefulness, I reached for James beside me, only to encounter empty space and the memory of yesterday's confrontation. I sat up slowly, the reality of my situation settling over me again. My husband had left, possibly for good. My relationship with my in-laws was likely beyond repair. The life I had built over 6 years of marriage hung in precarious balance, all because I had refused to surrender my inheritance to the Morgan family's ambitions. Before I could sink into the weight of these thoughts, my phone chimed with a text message. Maya, checking in as promised. How are you holding up? Need company today? I smiled despite everything. Maya's steady presence had been a constant in my life through every challenge: my mother's death, my father's illness, and now this unexpected marital crisis. James left, staying at his parents'. Could use the company if you're free. Her response was immediate: be there in an hour with bagels and moral support. As I showered and dressed, I found myself mentally cataloging the tasks ahead, both practical and emotional. I needed to contact a family law attorney as Sarah had suggested, not necessarily to file for divorce, but to understand my options if reconciliation proved impossible. I needed to schedule appointments with contractors to begin the restoration work on the house, fulfilling my promise to my father, and I needed to prepare myself for the likelihood that the Morgan family would not simply accept my decision and move on. Richard Morgan was not a man who took defeat gracefully. In the business world, he was known for aggressive tactics and strategic persistence. If he couldn't access my inheritance through persuasion and family pressure, he might resort to other methods. The thought sent an uneasy chill through me, reinforcing the wisdom of Sarah's advice to document everything and protect my assets. By the time Maya arrived, bearing the promised bagels along with coffee and a fierce loyalty that warmed me more than the hot drinks, I had developed a preliminary plan of action. First things first, I told her as we settled at the kitchen table. I need recommendations for a good family law attorney. Sarah Wilson gave me some names, but I trust your judgment too. Maya nodded thoughtfully. Claudia Martinez helped my cousin through a difficult divorce last year. She's thorough, discreet, and doesn't push for unnecessary conflict. I can text you her contact information. Perfect. I jotted the name in my notebook, next to the one Sarah had provided. I also need to get estimates for the roof repair and electrical upgrades. Those are the most urgent renovations needed. One crisis at a time, Maya cautioned gently. Have you heard from James today? I shook my head. No, and I don't expect to for at least a few days. He said he needed time to sort things out, but I think we both know what that really means. Which is? Maya prompted. He's hoping I'll reconsider if given time to come to my senses, I replied with a hint of bitterness. Or he's working with his father to find another way to pressure me into surrendering the inheritance. Either way, I don't anticipate a sudden epiphany where he recognizes my right to make decisions about my own property. Maya frowned. Has he always been this deferential to his parents? I know they're overbearing, but I never realized how much influence they had over him. In retrospect, the signs were always there, I admitted. Small things, like changing our vacation plans because his mother mentioned a conflicting family event, or larger things, like purchasing our condo in the building his father's company had developed, even though we'd found another place we both preferred. I just didn't see the pattern clearly until now. Or didn't want to see it, Maya suggested gently. We all have blind spots when it comes to the people we love. I nodded, acknowledging the truth in her observation. The irony is that I always thought James and I had a strong, independent marriage. We made our own traditions, built our own life together. At least, that's what I believed. Now I wonder how much of our relationship was shaped by Morgan family expectations without my even realizing it. What would you do? Maya asked after a moment. If James came back today and said he was choosing you over his family's expectations? Could you forgive the way they tried to manipulate you? The way he failed to stand up for you? It was the question I had been asking myself throughout the sleepless hours of the night. I don't know, I answered honestly. Part of me wants to believe we could rebuild what's been broken. But another part of me isn't sure I can ever trust him the same way again. He showed me something fundamental about his priorities, Maya. And I'm not sure that's something I can unsee. Before Maya could respond, the doorbell rang, an unexpected interruption that sent a surge of adrenaline through me. I wasn't expecting visitors, and after the events of the past few days, any unannounced arrival felt potentially threatening. Are you expecting someone? Maya asked, reading my expression. No, I replied, rising from the table. It could be a delivery, I suppose. But when I opened the front door, it wasn't a delivery person standing on my porch. It was Margaret Morgan, impeccably dressed in a camel haircoat and leather gloves, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. Elena, she greeted me, her voice carrying the brittle politeness she reserved for uncomfortable social situations. We need to talk. May I come in? I hesitated, torn between the instinct to refuse and the knowledge that whatever Margaret had come to say, it might be better to hear it directly rather than through James or another intermediary. Maya's here, I said finally, stepping back to allow her entry. We were just having coffee. Margaret's lips tightened almost imperceptibly at the mention of Maya, whom she had never particularly liked. This is a family matter, she said pointedly. Perhaps her friend could give us some privacy. Maya is staying, I replied firmly. Anything you have to say to me can be said in front of her. A flicker of annoyance crossed Margaret's carefully composed features, but she nodded stiffly and followed me to the kitchen, where Maya remained seated, her expression wary but composed. Margaret, she acknowledged with a coolness that matched my mother-in-law's. Unexpected to see you this morning. I'm sure, Margaret replied, declining the chair I offered and remaining standing. This won't take long. The tension in the room was palpable as Margaret gathered herself, smoothing non-existent wrinkles from her immaculate coat. Elena, she began, her tone one I recognized from charity board meetings when she was about to propose something she expected to be accepted without question. I understand there's been some miscommunication regarding your inheritance and our family's business opportunity. There hasn't been any miscommunication, I corrected her. I've been very clear about my intentions for the inheritance my father left me. Margaret waved a hand dismissively. Yes, the house renovations, a sentimental project, understandable given your recent loss. But Richard and I have been discussing the situation, and we believe we've found a solution that addresses everyone's needs. I exchanged a quick glance with Maya, whose raised eyebrow communicated volumes about her skepticism regarding any solution the Morgans might have devised. I'm listening, I said, keeping my tone neutral despite the wariness I felt. Margaret smiled thinly, pleased to have secured at least this small concession. Richard has been in contact with an architectural preservation specialist, quite renowned in her field. Actually, she's developed a proposal that would allow you to maintain ownership of this house. She gestured vaguely at her surroundings, while still freeing up the bulk of the inheritance funds for investment in the resort project. I frowned, confused. I don't understand. The trust is specifically structured for the house's restoration. The money can't be separated from the property. Not separated, Margaret corrected with the air of someone explaining a simple concept to a child. Repurposed. The proposal involves designating this house as a historical landmark with minimal renovations to maintain its structural integrity, then opening the first floor as a small museum or educational space dedicated to the architectural style of the era. She paused, clearly expecting me to be impressed by this creative solution. When I remained silent, she continued with mounting enthusiasm. This approach would satisfy the trust's requirement for maintaining or improving the property, but would require only a fraction of the funds allocated. The remainder could then be invested in the resort project as a separate venture, providing returns that would support the house's ongoing maintenance costs. I stared at her, momentarily speechless at the audacity of the plan. They had actually consulted a specialist and developed a detailed strategy to circumvent my father's wishes while technically satisfying the legal requirements of the trust. "Let me get this straight," I said finally. "Your solution is to turn my family home into a public museum, do minimal repairs rather than the full restoration my father wanted, and divert most of the inheritance to Richard's resort project anyway?" Margaret's smile faltered slightly. "You make it sound so transactional. This would be a legacy project honoring your family's history while simultaneously securing the Morgan family's future. The house would be preserved, just in a way that benefits more people, including, conveniently, the Morgan family's financial interests," Maya observed dryly from her seat at the table. Margaret shot her an irritated glance before focusing on me again. "Elena, this is a compromise. Everyone gets something they want. The house remains in your name, honoring your father's wishes and spirit, while the funds work more efficiently for everyone's benefit." I took a deep breath, tamping down the anger that threatened to overwhelm my composure. "Margaret, I appreciate that you've gone to the trouble of developing this proposal. But my answer remains the same. The inheritance will be used exactly as my father intended, for the complete restoration of this house as a private family home, not a public museum or educational space." "You're being stubborn," Margaret said, her facade of reasonableness slipping. "This isn't just about you anymore. James is devastated. Richard's project is collapsing. The family is in crisis, all because you refuse to consider alternatives that would benefit everyone. The family is in crisis because Richard made promises about money that wasn't his," I countered, my own patience wearing thin. "And because James apparently values his father's business interests more than his wife's autonomy and her father's final wishes." Margaret's expression hardened. "You've changed, Elena. You used to understand the importance of family unity and shared purpose. Now you're tearing everything apart over an old house and some misplaced sense of filial obligation." "I haven't changed," I replied quietly. "I've just finally recognized boundaries I should have established years ago. My inheritance is not negotiable, Margaret. Not for a museum, not for a resort, not for any purpose other than what my father intended." For a moment, something like genuine pain flashed across Margaret's carefully maintained face. "Do you have any idea what this is doing to James? He's caught between his wife and his family of origin. It's tearing him apart." A pang of empathy shot through me despite everything. Whatever my feelings about the Morgan family's tactics, I still love James. The thought of him suffering brought me no pleasure. "I'm sorry for that," I said sincerely. "But James is an adult who needs to make his own choices. If being caught between his wife and his parents is painful, perhaps he should ask himself why his parents are making demands about his wife's inheritance in the first place." Margaret's lips compressed into a thin line. "So that's your final answer? You won't even consider our proposal?" "That's my final answer," I confirmed. "The inheritance stays as my father intended it." She nodded stiffly, gathering her designer handbag from where she'd placed it on the counter. "Then I suppose there's nothing more to discuss." I had hoped you would be reasonable, for James's sake if nothing else. "I am being reasonable," I replied. "I'm simply not being compliant, which isn't the same thing." Margaret paused at the doorway, turning back with a last pointed remark. "You know, Elena, family is about compromise and mutual support. If you can't put the family's needs above your own sentimentality, perhaps you should reconsider whether you truly belong in it at all." With that parting shot, she left, the front door closing behind her with a decisive click that seemed to underscore the finality of her statement. Maya let out a low whistle once we were alone again. "Wow. Did she just suggest you either hand over your inheritance or get out of the family?" "Pretty much," I confirmed, sinking back into my chair at the kitchen table. Apparently compromise in the Morgan family only goes one way, everyone else accommodating what they want. "That was some next-level manipulation," Maya observed, pushing a fresh coffee toward me. "Coming here alone, without James or Richard, playing the concerned mother-in-law while basically delivering the same ultimatum in a different package." I wrapped my hands around the warm mug, grateful for its comforting weight. "The thing is, I almost feel sorry for her. In her mind, family unity really does mean everyone falling in line with whatever Richard and James decide. She genuinely can't understand why I would prioritize my father's wishes over the Morgan family business interests, because in her world, individuals don't get to have separate priorities from the family, Maya pointed out. Especially women who marry into it. You were supposed to become a Morgan in all ways, leaving your own family's values and priorities behind. The insight resonated with uncomfortable clarity. Over the years, I had made dozens of small accommodations to fit into the Morgan family dynamic, changing holiday traditions, adopting their social circles, even modifying my personal style to better match their polished aesthetic. None of these changes had seemed significant in isolation, but collectively they represented a gradual submersion of my identity into theirs. Until now, until my father's inheritance had drawn a line I refused to cross, exposing the conditional nature of my acceptance into their family. I need to talk to James, I said suddenly. Not about the inheritance, my decision on that is final. But about us, about whether there's anything left to salvage between us without the Morgan family approval. Maya nodded thoughtfully. Do you think he'll be willing to have that conversation? From what you've said, he seems pretty firmly entrenched in his parents' position. I don't know, I admitted. But I need to try. Whatever happens next, I want to know I made every effort to communicate directly with my husband, not just through his parents or their proposals. Fair enough, Maya agreed. Just be careful, okay? The Morgans have shown they're willing to apply significant pressure to get what they want. Don't put yourself in a vulnerable position. Her concern was valid. The past few days had revealed aspects of my in-law's character that suggested they might not limit themselves to emotional manipulation if other tactics failed. After Maya left, promising to check in later, I called James. The conversation was brief and stilted. He seemed surprised to hear from me so soon but agreed to meet at a neutral location, a coffee shop downtown, later that afternoon. Neither of us mentioned his mother's visit or the museum proposal, though I suspected he knew about both. The coffee shop was moderately busy when I arrived, providing a reassuring buffer of anonymous witnesses should the conversation become heated. James was already there, seated at a table near the back, a cappuccino cooling in front of him. He looked exhausted, dark circles shadowing his eyes, his normally immaculate appearance slightly rumpled. Thanks for coming, I said as I slid into the chair opposite him. He nodded, his expression guarded. Your call surprised me. I thought we agreed to take some time apart. Your mother visited this morning, I replied, deciding directness was the best approach. With a proposal about turning the house into a museum and diverting most of the inheritance to your father's resort project anyway. James had the grace to look uncomfortable. I told her not to do that, that approaching you directly would only make things worse. So you knew about the plan, I observed, not particularly surprised but still disappointed. Dad's lawyer and a preservation consultant developed it yesterday, he admitted. They thought it might satisfy both the legal requirements of the trust and the family's investment needs. Did it occur to any of you that it completely contradicts my father's actual wishes? That he specifically wanted the house restored as a private family home, not turned into a public museum with minimal repairs? James sighed, running a hand through his hair in the familiar gesture of frustration. Elena, try to see this from our perspective. Dad's project is collapsing. Investors are walking away. His reputation in the development community is at stake, all because of a house that, frankly, would be better served by professional preservation than by remaining a private residence in a neighborhood that's rapidly commercializing anyway. I stared at him, momentarily speechless at his framing of the situation. James, I didn't cause your father's project to collapse. He did, by making financial commitments based on money he didn't control. And this isn't just a house, it's my family home, my inheritance, my father's legacy to me. I know that, he conceded, his tone softening slightly. But surely there's a middle ground we could find, some way to honor both families' needs. That's why I wanted to meet, I said, leaning forward slightly. Not to discuss the inheritance, that decision is made and final. But to talk about us, about whether our marriage can survive this fundamental difference in values and priorities. James was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable as he stared into his coffee cup. When he finally looked up, his eyes held a mixture of resignation and resolve. "I love you, Elena," he said quietly. "These past 6 years have been the happiest of my life. But I don't see how we move forward from here. You've made it clear you won't compromise on the inheritance, and my family. Well, you know how they feel." "Your family," I repeated, focusing on the key point. "James, we're married. We're supposed to be our own family unit first, with our families of origin secondary. But from everything that's happened these past few days, it seems like your parents' approval and business interests still take precedence over our marriage." He frowned, clearly uncomfortable with my characterization. "That's not fair. I'm trying to balance multiple loyalties and responsibilities." "But that's just it," I pressed. "When those loyalties conflict, your family of origin seems to automatically take priority. You left our home to stay with your parents. You participated in developing a proposal to circumvent my wishes after I explicitly refused to redirect the inheritance. Your first concern has been how this affects your father's business and your standing in the family, not how it affects our relationship. And your first concern has been your father's wishes, not our marriage," he countered defensively. "The difference," I pointed out gently, "is that my father never asked me to choose between honoring his legacy and maintaining my relationship with you. He never tried to control your inheritance or financial decisions. Your parents, on the other hand, have explicitly framed this as a choice between compliance with their demands and my place in the family." James had no immediate response to that, the truth of it apparently too evident to deny. Finally, he sighed deeply. "I don't know how to fix this, Elena. I really don't. I can't turn my back on my family, especially not when Dad's facing financial disaster." "I'm not asking you to turn your back on them," I clarified. "I'm asking you to establish appropriate boundaries with them regarding our marriage and my inheritance. To make it clear that their demands and manipulations are unacceptable, even if you continue to support them in other ways." "They won't accept that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dad sees this as a loyalty test. Either we're part of the family solution to the investment crisis, or we're part of the problem." "And where do you stand in that binary?" I asked, echoing my question from our last conversation, still seeking the answer he had evaded. James looked up, meeting my eyes directly for the first time since we'd sat down. "I don't know how to be the man you need me to be right now," he admitted. "The man who can stand up to his father, risk his position in the family, potentially sacrifice his career prospects, all for a principle that frankly, I don't fully understand or share." The honesty was painful but clarifying. "And I don't know how to be the woman your family wants me to be," I replied. "Someone who would sacrifice her father's carefully planned legacy for a business opportunity. Someone who would allow her husband's family to dictate how she uses her inheritance." We sat in silence for several moments, the ambient noise of the coffee shop a stark contrast to the heavy quiet between us. The realization was settling over both of us, not dramatic or sudden, but gradual and inexorable. We had reached an impasse that neither of us knew how to bridge. "So where does that leave us?" James asked finally. "I think," I said carefully, "it leaves us needing to seriously consider whether our marriage can continue given this fundamental incompatibility in values and priorities." He nodded slowly, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than agreement. "I still love you," he said, his voice catching slightly. "I still love you too," I replied, my own throat tight with emotion. "But love isn't always enough, is it? Not when there's such a fundamental disconnect in how we view family loyalty and personal autonomy." "No," he agreed quietly. "I suppose it isn't." We parted with no clear resolution, only a mutual understanding that we would both take more time to consider our options before making any final decisions about our marriage. But as I drove home alone, I felt a growing certainty that we had reached a breaking point from which there was no return to what we had been before. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange limbo. James remained at his parents' house, and we communicated primarily through brief, practical text messages about bills or mail. I met with Claudia Martinez, the family law attorney Maya had recommended, to understand my options should divorce become inevitable. I also began the process of interviewing contractors for the house restoration, focusing my energy on honoring my father's wishes rather than dwelling on the uncertainty of my marriage. Richard Morgan made one final attempt to access the inheritance, this time through a formal legal letter suggesting that as James's spouse, I had a fiduciary responsibility to consider family financial interests when making decisions about significant assets. Claudia dismissed this as intimidation tactics with no legal foundation, given the specific structure of my father's trust, and drafted a response that firmly but professionally closed the door on any further discussion of the matter. After that, silence from the Morgan family. No more proposals, no more visits, no more legal threats. Just a cold detachment that suggested they had finally accepted my decision but would never forgive it. 17 days after James had left our home, he called and asked to meet again. This time, he suggested the house, our house, my house, a choice that struck me as potentially significant. He arrived looking better than he had at the coffee shop, more rested, more composed, though still carrying a tension that hadn't been present before the Thanksgiving disaster. I met him at the door with a neutral greeting, uncertain what to expect from this conversation. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he said as we settled in the living room, the same space where our confrontation had begun on Thanksgiving Day. "So have I replied simply. James nodded, his gaze moving around the room, taking in the familiar surroundings with what seemed like new appreciation. "I spoke with my father yesterday. It was difficult, but necessary." I raised an eyebrow, surprised by this development. "Oh?" "I told him that regardless of what happens between you and me, his attempts to control your inheritance were inappropriate and disrespectful, that the pressure he and Mom have been applying has damaged not just my marriage but my relationship with them as well." This was unexpected. James standing up to his father had seemed almost unimaginable based on everything that had happened. "How did he take it?" I asked cautiously. A rueful smile crossed James's face. "About as well as you'd expect. Anger, accusations of disloyalty, threats about my position in the company. But then something surprising happened. After the initial explosion, he actually seemed to reflect, to consider what I was saying." "That doesn't sound like Richard," I observed, remembering my father-in-law's typically unyielding nature. "It surprised me too," James admitted. "But I think the past few weeks have been humbling for him. The resort project has completely fallen apart. Several major investors have pulled out of other Morgan development projects as well, concerned about the company's financial planning. He's facing business challenges he hasn't encountered in decades." I wasn't sure how to respond. While I took no pleasure in Richard's business difficulties, I couldn't summon much sympathy either, given his role in creating the entire situation. "Anyway," James continued after a moment, "that conversation made me realize something important. Something I should have recognized much sooner." "What's that?" I asked. "That I've been living my entire adult life trying to meet my father's expectations, secure his approval, advance according to his plans. Even my career choice, my investment strategies, where we live, all of it has been subtly or not so subtly influenced by what would best position me within the Morgan family business structure." This self-awareness was new and, I had to admit, somewhat encouraging. "That's a significant realization," I said carefully. James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It made me think about your father too. About how different his approach was. He never pressured you to follow a specific career path or adopt his values. He supported your choices even when they took you in directions he might not have chosen for you." "That was his way," I agreed, a familiar ache of loss sweeping through me at the memory of my father's unconditional support. "He believed his job was to raise me to make my own good decisions, not to make my decisions for me." I admired that about him, James said quietly. "Even if I didn't fully understand it until now." I studied him, trying to gauge where this conversation was heading. "James, why are you here? What are you trying to say?" He took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders as if preparing for something difficult. I'm here to tell you that I was wrong. Wrong to pressure you about the inheritance, wrong to prioritize my parents' expectations over your autonomy, wrong to leave rather than stand by you when my family was manipulating and threatening you. The words hung in the air between us, unexpected and weighty with implication. That's significant, I said finally, unwilling to rush to forgiveness despite the relief I felt at his acknowledgement. But it doesn't change the fundamental incompatibility we identified. You still have strong ties to your family, ties that will create ongoing tensions if we try to continue our marriage. I know, he admitted. And I'm not suggesting we can simply pick up where we left off as if nothing happened. Too much has been revealed, too much damage done. What I am suggesting is that perhaps, with time and genuine effort on my part, we could build something new. Something healthier, with appropriate boundaries and mutual respect. I considered his words carefully, wary of easy promises but touched by the evident sincerity in his expression. What would that look like, practically speaking? For starters, I've accepted a job offer from Westridge Partners, he said, naming a competing investment firm across town. I'm leaving my current position, and any future role at Morgan Development, behind. I need to establish my career independent of my father's influence or approval. This was genuinely surprising, a concrete step that demonstrated serious commitment to change. That's a major decision, I observed. How do your parents feel about it? They are not happy, he admitted with a slight grimace. Dad sees it as another betrayal, though I think he understands the necessity on some level. Mom is more concerned about the social implications, how it will look to their friends and business associates. And how do you feel about it? I asked, more interested in his perspective than his parents' reactions. A slow smile spread across his face, the first genuine one I'd seen since before Thanksgiving. Terrified. Excited. Relieved. All at once. It's the first truly independent professional decision I've made in years, maybe ever. I nodded, acknowledging the significance of this step. And what about us? What are you proposing exactly? The smile faded, replaced by a more serious expression. I'm not asking to move back in immediately, or for things to return to how they were. I'm suggesting we consider couples counseling, take time to rebuild trust, establish clearer boundaries with my family, and see if what we once had can evolve into something stronger and more equal. The proposal was measured, realistic in its acknowledgement of the damage done and the work required to repair it. There was no pressure, no ultimatum, just an honest suggestion that perhaps, with effort and time, reconciliation might be possible. I appreciate that, I said after a thoughtful pause. And I'm willing to consider counseling as a first step. But James, I need you to understand something fundamental. My decision about the inheritance is non-negotiable, not just now but forever. If we try to rebuild our relationship, it has to be with the complete understanding that my father's wishes for this house will be honored, regardless of any future business opportunities your family might identify. I understand, he said solemnly. And I accept that boundary completely. The house and restoration fund are yours to use as you see fit, without input or pressure from me or my family. I studied him, searching for any hint of reservation or insincerity, but found only earnest resolution. Whether this newfound clarity would withstand future pressure from his parents remained to be seen, but the commitment itself seemed genuine. All right, I said finally. I'm willing to try counseling, to see if there's a path forward for us. But I'm making no promises beyond that. We'll take it one step at a time and evaluate whether the fundamental issues can truly be resolved. Relief washed over James's face, followed quickly by a more tempered expression of cautious hope. That's all I'm asking for, a chance to show you that I can be the partner you deserve, not just an extension of the Morgan family interests. As he left that day, there was no passionate embrace, no dramatic declarations of undying love. Just a quiet, mutual acknowledgement that perhaps, with work and time, something valuable might be salvaged from the wreckage of our previous understanding. I stood on the porch watching his car pull away, feeling neither triumph nor despair, just a muted hope tinged with caution. Whether our marriage would ultimately survive remained an open question, but for the first time since Thanksgiving, I could envision a possible future where James and I found our way back to each other, not as we had been before, but as something new and potentially stronger. 3 months later, the first phase of the house restoration was nearing completion. The roof had been repaired, the electrical system updated to modern standards while preserving the original fixtures, and the plumbing issues addressed. The contractor, a specialist in historical renovations, had taken particular care with the original woodwork, restoring rather than replacing wherever possible. James and I were still living separately but meeting regularly, both for counseling sessions and for cautious dates where we were gradually rediscovering each other outside the shadow of the Morgan family expectations. He had settled into his new position at Westridge Partners, establishing himself independent of his father's influence for the first time in his professional life. The distance from his parents had been difficult but clarifying. Richard and Margaret had eventually accepted, if not embraced, James's decisions regarding both his career and our marriage. They maintained a cool politeness toward me on the rare occasions we interacted, but the overt pressure and manipulation had ceased. As for the house, it was slowly reclaiming its former glory, each restored detail a tribute to my father's foresight and care. I often found myself standing in the center of a room, watching the contractor's work, imagining how pleased he would be to see his beloved family home receiving the attention it deserved. On a bright spring afternoon, as I supervised the delivery of period-appropriate light fixtures for the dining room, my phone buzzed with a text from James, "Meeting finished early. Still okay if I come by to see the progress?" I smiled, typing back a quick affirmative response. Over the past weeks, James had shown genuine interest in the restoration process, asking thoughtful questions and offering support without trying to influence my decisions. It was a small but significant indicator of the changes he was working to make in our relationship. When he arrived, I gave him a tour of the recent renovations, pointing out the careful restoration of the original crown molding in the living room and the specially milled replacements for damaged floorboards in the hallway. "It's really coming together," he observed as we stood in the kitchen, now equipped with modern appliances that somehow didn't look out of place among the vintage cabinetry. "Your father would be proud." "I think so," I agreed, feeling the familiar mixture of sadness and satisfaction that accompanied thoughts of my father these days. "The contractor says we're about halfway through the planned renovations. Another 3 to 4 months, and everything on the priority list will be complete." James nodded, his expression thoughtful as he leaned against the counter. "Have you given any more thought to what you want to do once it's finished? Will you sell your condo and move in there permanently?" It was a question I had been considering for weeks, weighing practical considerations against emotional attachments. "I think so," I said slowly. "It feels right, somehow. Like this is where I'm meant to be." He was quiet for a moment, seemingly considering his next words carefully. "And is there room in that future for me?" "Not now," he added quickly. "I know we're still finding our way, still rebuilding trust. But eventually. Could you see us making a home here together?" The question touched on hopes and fears I had been cautiously nurturing but had been hesitant to articulate. During our months apart and subsequent cautious reconciliation, I had come to recognize both what I had lost and what might still be possible between us. "I admitted softly, "if we continue on this path, if the changes you've been making prove sustainable even under pressure from your family. I could see us building a life here together, honoring my father's legacy while creating our own." Relief and hope bloomed in James's expression. "That's all I needed to hear," he said. "Not a promise, just a possibility. Something to work toward." As he left that afternoon, there was a newfound lightness in his step, a quiet confidence that hadn't been present in our earlier, more tentative interactions. And I found myself standing on the porch, just as I had months earlier when he had first proposed counseling, watching his car pull away with a sense of cautious optimism. The inheritance that had nearly destroyed our marriage had also, paradoxically, created the opportunity for something more authentic to take its place. By forcing a confrontation about values, priorities, and family dynamics, it had cleared away pretenses and revealed truths that might otherwise have remained hidden for years. Whether James and I would ultimately find our way back to each other completely remained uncertain. The path ahead still contained challenges, his parents' continued coolness, The ongoing process of establishing healthier boundaries, the gradual rebuilding of trust between us. But for the first time since that fateful Thanksgiving Day when my husband had demanded I surrender my inheritance to his family, I felt truly hopeful about our future. Because the crisis had revealed not just the weaknesses in our relationship, but also the strength of my own convictions and James's capacity for growth and change. Whatever happened next, I knew I had honored my father's wishes and my own values, and that, I was beginning to understand, was the most valuable inheritance of all, not money or property, but the courage to stand firm when it mattered most. As I turned to go back inside, running my hand along the newly restored porch railing, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. This house, with its history and memories, would stand for another generation, exactly as my father had wanted, and I would move forward either with James or without him, knowing I had stayed true to what mattered most. In the end, that was a legacy worth any price. 6 months later, the restoration was complete. The house stood transformed yet fundamentally unchanged, its historic character preserved while discreetly incorporating modern comforts and necessities. It was exactly what my father had envisioned, a perfect balance of respect for the past and adaptability to the present. James and I had continued our careful rebuilding process as well. Weekly counseling sessions had gradually given way to more natural interactions as we relearned how to be partners rather than adversaries. He had maintained his professional independence, thriving at his new firm despite occasional pointed remarks from his father about family loyalty. Most importantly, he had established and maintained clear boundaries with his parents regarding our relationship and my inheritance. When Richard had made one final attempt to suggest a joint venture involving the newly restored house, James had shut down the conversation immediately and firmly, making it clear that the topic was permanently off limits. That evening, as the setting sun cast a golden glow through the restored stained glass panels of the front door, James and I sat on the porch swing, a bottle of wine and 2 glasses on the small table beside us. It was a moment of simple contentment after months of difficult work, both on the house and on ourselves. "I have something I want to ask you," James said, his voice carrying a hint of nervousness despite our relaxed surroundings. I turned to look at him, curious about the sudden shift in his tone. "What is it?" He took a deep breath, reaching for my hand. "The lease on my apartment is up next month. I've been thinking, hoping, that maybe it's time for us to live together again, here, in your family home." The request was significant, a formal step toward full reconciliation after months of cautious progress. I considered it carefully, aware of all that had changed between us since Thanksgiving Day almost a year ago. "Are you sure?" I asked. "Living here means accepting that this will always be my family home first, with all the history and meaning that entails. It's not just another house we happen to own." "I know," he said softly, "and that's what I've come to appreciate. This house isn't just a structure or an asset, it's a living connection to your past, to the people who came before you. That matters in a way I didn't understand before." I studied him, searching for any hint of the old James who had dismissed the house as a money pit, and my attachment to it as mere sentimentality. But I saw only genuine understanding and respect in his eyes. "Okay," I said finally. "Yes. I think it's time." His smile was radiant, a flash of the unguarded joy I had fallen in love with years ago. "Really?" "Really," I confirmed. "But with one condition." "Name it," he said immediately. "This isn't just my house anymore, or even our house," I explained. "It's our home. That means you have a voice in how we live here, what we change or keep the same going forward. Not the fundamental character, that stays as my father wanted. But the details of our life within these walls? Those we decide together." James nodded solemnly, understanding the significance of what I was offering, not just reconciliation, but partnership on new and more equal terms. "I'd like that," he said, squeezing my hand. "More than you know." As darkness fell around us, we remained on the porch swing, talking quietly about practical arrangements and future plans. The house stood solid behind us, its restored structure a testament to history preserved and honored, and our conversation, with its give and take of ideas and preferences, marked the beginning of a new chapter, one built on mutual respect rather than dominance or surrender. The inheritance that had nearly cost me my marriage had ultimately transformed it instead, stripping away pretenses and forcing a reckoning with values and priorities too long unexamined. The price had been high: months of uncertainty, painful confrontations, the permanent cooling of relationships with my in-laws. But the reward was proving worth it, a relationship founded on authenticity rather than accommodation, on partnership rather than control. When we finally moved inside, hand in hand, the house seemed to welcome us with the familiar creaks and settling sounds of a structure that had weathered many storms and would weather many more. This was what my father had wanted for me, not just the physical property, but the legacy of standing firm for what mattered, of honoring history while building a future on my own terms. As I closed the door behind us, I felt a profound sense of rightness settle over me. The journey had been difficult, the outcome uncertain until the very end. But here we were, finding our way forward together in a home that represented both where we had come from and where we were going. And in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that I had made the right choice on that fateful Thanksgiving Day when my husband had demanded I surrender my inheritance to his family. By saying no, firmly, unequivocally, despite the cost, I had ultimately said yes to something far more valuable: a life of integrity, autonomy, and genuine partnership.